Welcome to Quiet Scare, where horror doesn't scream, it whispers. These are authentic, documented experiences, real encounters, carefully curated and adapted with a light touch to preserve what happened and deepen the hush around it. Please like and subscribe, and tap the bell to catch new episodes. There are no more than 3 ads in the first 15 minutes, then uninterrupted playback. Quiet, literary horror shaped from true accounts for sophisticated listeners. Sleep well and dream dark. I'm only writing this down because my medical records and the ranger report don't tell the whole story. On paper, it's severe frostbite and hypothermia after being stranded during a cold snap in the mountains. That's technically true, but it leaves out the part that keeps me awake when the forecast says clear and cold and the moon is supposed to be bright. Last winter, after everything in my life sort of collapsed at once, job, relationship, the whole stack, I went up to a friend's cabin in the mountains to be alone. The plan was simple. A few days with no signal, no people, just snow and silence. I drove up in the late afternoon. By the time I hit the upper switchbacks, the sky had that heavy purple winter look, and the plows had piled snow into walls on either side of the road. The cabin is small, just a box and a thin clearing carved out of pines. I unlocked it, cranked the propane heater, got the wood stove going. Same routine as always. The air inside was stale but familiar. Old smoke, dry wood, cold metal. I made some tea, watched the fire catch, and tried to believe I'd made a healthy decision instead of running away. The first weird thing happened when I went to check if the back door was fully latched. The snow outside looked off. It was glowing with this hard bluish-white light, too pure and flat, like someone had laid a sheet of LED paneling over the ground. I looked up and saw the moon. It was wrong. It hung low and huge, way bigger than it should be. The edges were too sharp, so crisp they almost cut into the sky, and instead of the usual pale yellow or soft white, it was this cold burner blue, the color you get when a gas flame is turned up too high. It hurt to look at. The trees around the clearing threw long shadows, but right up near the cabin those shadows just stopped. The light came from everywhere at once, wiping out any darkness near the walls. I put my hand near the window without touching it. I could feel the cold radiating through the glass before my fingers got anywhere close. My breath fogged the inside of the pane, and that's when the frost started to move. At first it was the normal ferny patterns, spreading from the bottom edge. Then the lines straightened. They bent at clean angles, connected, stopped dead, like pen strokes. I watched wide awake, totally sober as the frost thickened into lines that were too straight, too deliberate. The words came in one slow, continuous motion. Come closer. White letters, about the length of my hand, raised slightly from the rest of the frost. They looked like they'd been written from the outside. I know how that sounds. I told myself the obvious things. You're exhausted. You drove in bad weather. Your brain is preloaded with stress. Humans see patterns and randomness all the time. I backed away until my shoulders hit the far wall, dragged the curtain shut, and layered optical illusion over the rising panic. I didn't look again that night. I wrapped myself in blankets by the stove, kept the fire going, and at some point drifted off in that wired, shallow way where you're never really fully asleep. Morning looked normal at first. The sky was clear and icy blue. My phone said it was below 0. The snow outside the cabin squeaked under my boots like styrofoam when I stepped out onto the porch. Inside, the frost on the window had melted into a plain film of condensation. No letters, just cold glass. If that had been the end of it, I would have chalked everything up to exhaustion. Around midday, I finally got a radio station tuned in. The host was talking about some rare astronomical event, a perigee, something about unusual brightness, high-altitude ice crystals, and spectacular moonlight for a few nights. The phrase he used stuck with me. It's going to look unreal up there. Unreal. Yeah, no kidding. All day I tried to act normal. I read an old paperback, I swept some snow off the porch. I made myself eat, but every time I let my mind wander, it went right back to the words on the glass and that unnatural blue glare. That night, the storm rolled in. By early evening, thick clouds were overhead, and snow was blowing sideways. You'd think that would dim the moon. It didn't. As the night deepened, the cabin started filling with that same bluish-white light, pushing in through the curtains and cracks around the frame. Shadows went weird too sharp, angled wrong for the single bulb or the stove. It felt like being lit by something just above the roof. I cracked the back door open to look, even though every instinct told me not to. The clearing was flooded with light so intense it almost buzzed. Every snowflake in the air was visible as it blew past, each one frozen for a split second like 1,000 tiny glass chips suspended mid-flight. The storm should have cut visibility down to nothing, but I could see everything, every branch, every drift, all smoothed and bleached by that impossible moonlight. That's when I saw the hare. A snowshoe hare darted from the tree line, almost invisible against the snow except for its dark eyes. It sprinted across the clearing, heading straight through the brightest patch between me and the woods. There was no gradual freezing, no buildup of ice. 1 second it was alive and moving. The next second it was a perfect glass sculpture mid-leap. I heard it, this high, brittle crackling, like someone walking on thin ice. Tiny fractures spiderwebbed through its body. Then it shattered. It just broke apart and scattered across the snow in glittering fragments. No blood, no mess, just a burst of frozen pieces that skipped across the surface and blew away on the wind. At the exact moment it shattered, the cold hit me. It was like opening a door directly into liquid nitrogen. My eyelashes frosted in an instant. The air in my lungs burned. My hand on the doorknob went from normal to numb, so fast it almost felt hot first. I slammed the door, but the cold didn't stay outside. I could feel it pushing through the walls, radiating in from the windows. The heater was still running, the stove was roaring, and my breath still smoked in front of my face inside the cabin. I turned, and the frost was already creeping up the inside of the window again. This time, it wrote faster. Come out. The letters were larger, spanning most of the pane. The strokes thickened until they almost glowed with reflected moonlight leaking through the glass. I whispered no out loud without meaning to, just to hear my own voice. Then the heater cut off. Just a soft click, but the timing was perfect, like a response. The silence that followed made my ears ring. No fan, no hum, just the distant scream of the wind and the quiet squeak of frost spreading over glass. I didn't sleep much that second night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hair breaking apart, or the letters forming on the window. The cabin stayed bright with that awful light, until nearly dawn. When it finally dimmed, I crashed hard. The next morning, daylight made everything look boring and harmless again. The frost on the window was back to random patterns. When I stepped outside, I forced myself to walk to the edge of the clearing to look for proof anything. Hairy remains, weird ice, tracks. There was nothing. There was nothing. The snow was smooth and untouched, except for my own footprints. No shattered glassy chunks. No disturbed patch where something had exploded into frozen pieces. Just wind-polished snow. That should have comforted me. It didn't. Because that's when I saw the shapes between the trees. They were far enough back that at first my brain filed them under snow-laden stumps and weirdly shaped drifts. But the longer I stared, the more they resolved into people, or what had been people. They were standing in irregular clusters, half hidden by trunks and branches. I could make out the slope of shoulders, the angles of elbows, the tilt of heads turned slightly away from the clearing. Their postures weren't neutral. They were caught mid-flinch, mid-turn, mid-raise of the hands. Like the last thing they did before freezing was try to shield themselves from something overhead. They all had that same glassy sheen. No visible faces, no clothing details. Just human outlines smoothed into ice. I told myself they were trees. I told myself I was looking too hard. I told myself anything I could think of that wasn't there are frozen people standing in the woods. The radio kept talking about the rare lunar event and dangerously low wind chills. The announcer said the words record-breaking cold 3 separate times. At some point, I heard that parts of the state had hit temperatures they'd never recorded before. They blamed Arctic air, polar vortices, whatever. No one mentioned a moon that burned the shadows off the ground. By the 3rd night, I wasn't even pretending to be calm. I layered every piece of clothing I had, made sure my boots and keys were right by the door, and kept the stove cranked as high as I dared. I told myself I might have to ride out one more weird night, and then drive down first thing in the morning. The light seeped in even earlier this time. It wasn't just from the windows anymore. It felt like the walls themselves were glowing. Every object in the cabin had a razor-edge shadow. My breath clouded thick white in front of my face, hanging there far too long. I could feel the cold in my teeth. I looked at the window one last time. The frost was already writing, "Come closer," underneath the words. The frost thickened in smears like the impressions of hands pressing outward from the glass. Long streaks, 5-fingered shapes. They weren't perfectly formed, just suggestions, but my brain filled in the rest. This was the point where later people would tell me I must have been hallucinating from hypothermia. Maybe they're right. All I can say is, I knew, with that deep animal certainty, that if I stayed through one more cycle of that light, I wouldn't be leaving walking on my own feet. So I left while it was still night. I pulled on my coat, scarf, hat, everything, and went for the door. My chest felt tight, like I'd been breathing freezer air for hours. The doorknob burned my palm through the glove. When I stepped outside, it felt like the air itself was solid. I could feel the cold on my eyeballs. I'm not exaggerating. It was the worst physical sensation I've ever experienced, like my lungs were being sandblasted with ice particles every time I inhaled. My car was maybe 30 feet away. It looked impossibly far. The snow between the cabin and the car had gone from powder to some kind of hard, glassy crust. My boots didn't sink. They skidded. Each step cracked a thin layer like walking on a frozen puddle. The blue-white light washed out everything. The car looked like a toy floating at the edge of some reflective surface. That's when I realized the frozen figures in the trees were closer than before. I didn't see them move all at once. I just caught small changes, an angle that wasn't there before, a shoulder that had shifted a few inches, an arm that was higher. As I moved, I heard faint cracking noises from the tree line, like slow-motion ice breakup. One figure's head seemed to tilt, just slightly in my direction. I should have run, but running in that cold doesn't feel possible. My body felt clumsy and heavy, my muscles slow and thick. I focused on not falling. My fingers were already half numb inside my gloves. My feet felt like someone else's. I reached the car by not thinking about anything except the next step. My hand stuck to the metal door handle for a second when I grabbed it. I fumbled the key, missed the lock once, and honestly don't remember getting the door open. I just remember suddenly being half inside, dragging it shut behind me. The inside of the car was barely warmer, but it was at least out of the direct moonlight. Frost bloomed instantly across the windows, turning the clearing into a pale blur. I could still see vague shapes between the trees though. Haloed in that awful glow, my hands barely worked, but after a couple failed tries, the engine turned over. The air coming from the vents wasn't warm at first. It just moved. I dropped the car into gear and eased it forward, feeling the tires slip and catch on the hard-packed track. As I pulled away, the light outside changed. It didn't vanish, it shrank, as if I were leaving the center of a beam. The further down the mountain I drove, the more ordinary the world looked. Just another frigid winter night with blowy snow and crappy visibility. I made it to the ER on adrenaline and autopilot. They said I had moderate frostbite in several fingers and toes, plus hypothermia. They slid warm IV fluids into me, wrapped my hands and feet in heated pads, and kept asking how long I'd been lost out there. Apparently my story cabin, moonlight, shattered animal, frozen people in the trees didn't match what they expected. When I told them about the frost writing on the inside of the window, they exchanged a particular kind of look I recognized from people who are trying not to say you might be losing it. One resident asked, very gently, if I'd taken anything drugs, alcohol, meds I didn't normally use. Another floated altitude effects and confusional state secondary to hypothermia. A sheriff's deputy went up to check the site a couple days later, after the worst of the cold broke. His report says exactly this. Cabin intact. No evidence of forced entry. Wood stove out. Interior cold. Frost patterns typical. No sign of other people or animals. Vehicle tracks lead away without incident. If you talk to people in that town, some will tell you the moon really was strange those nights. There are pictures on their phones, overexposed discs, bright hazy rings, bad camera artifacts. Amateur astronomers wrote little blog posts about the rare alignment and how great the viewing was. That part is all documented, totally normal. What's not documented is the animal that shattered like spun glass under that light, or the way the frost formed words that no random pattern ever would, or the fact that I'm missing just enough sensation in a few fingertips and toes that winter doesn't feel abstract to me anymore. It feels like something with teeth. I've looked up the orbital data since then. I know exactly when that particular configuration of moon and earth and atmosphere is supposed to happen again. When it does, I won't be anywhere near the mountains. Honestly, I don't even like being outside on clear, bright, full moon nights at all now. Even in town. Believe me or don't. On paper, it's a cold weather accident with a clean medical explanation. But I know what I saw pressed into the frost on that window. I know what was starting to move in the trees when I walked out into that impossible light. If there's a lesson in any of this, it's simple. When the moon is too bright, and the cold feels wrong, not just freezing but hungry, don't go closer to the window. Don't go out to get a better look. Some things out there don't want you to admire them. They want you to join the line of glassy shapes in the trees. I don't really know how to start this without sounding insane, so I'll just say it straight. Last winter, I watched my own breath write words in the air. This happened in the mountains, at my uncle's old cabin. If any of you follow local news around remote property disputes and historic remains, you might even be able to guess the county, but I'm not going to name it. I had to sign enough paperwork already. My uncle died in November. No spouse, no kids. Just the cabin and a bunch of old tools and junk he left behind. The rest of my family wanted nothing to do with it. It was too far, too cold, and honestly, they'd always thought he was off. I grew up going up there a few times, though, and I felt like I owed it to him to at least go through his things before we sold it. That's how I ended up driving alone into the mountains in the middle of a snowstorm, with a bed full of plastic bins and a manila envelope full of keys and legal documents on the passenger seat. By the time I reached the turnoff, it was already late. The forest was that thick, dark kind where the trees all look the same, and the road is just two ruts in the snow, pretending to be a driveway. I parked where the track ended, left the engine running for a minute, and just sat there staring at the shape of the cabin through the falling snow. When I finally opened the door, the cold hit me like a physical shove. I stepped out, my boots crunching on the crusted surface, and exhaled. My breath came out in a thick white plume. Then it flattened. That's the only way I can describe it. Instead of just drifting away, it stretched itself into a thin sheet right in front of my face, like frosted glass hanging in the air, and letters started to form in it. T-A-L-L. Ongna. Tiwastrayan Owabo. The word hung there, perfectly legible, floating in the cloud of my breath. I froze, half crouched out of the truck, door still open behind me. I blinked, thinking I was seeing shapes in the vapor, like people do with clouds. But the edges of the letters were sharp, too sharp. I watched the whole thing disintegrate a second later, as the wind pushed through it and it was just normal mist again, fading into the dark. I immediately tried to rationalize it. I'd been driving for hours. My eyes were tired. The headlights were cutting through falling snow at a weird angle. I tried to replay it in my head and tell myself I'd misread the swirls. but my pulse was going too fast, and the air suddenly felt too close. I did the obvious thing. I tested it. I took another breath and exhaled slowly, watching. This time, my breath just puffed out like normal and disappeared. I laughed. This nervous, shaky laugh that sounded wrong in the empty woods. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself and hauled the first bin out of the truck. On the short walk to the porch, I exhaled a few more times on purpose, checking. Nothing. Just normal breath fog. By the time I wrestled the door open and stepped into the dark cabin, I'd convinced myself the hello was a fluke. Some weird alignment of cold and headlights and wishful thinking. The inside of the cabin smelled like dust, old wood, and the faint ammonia of mouse piss. My uncle had always kept it stocked and locked, and it was like time stopped when he stopped coming. The windows were filmed with frost, the furniture buried under a layer of cold dust. I dropped the bin next to the wood stove and used my phone light to find the box of kindling and matches. While I was stacking the wood, a random childhood memory hit me. So vividly I almost heard his voice. "You know why it's so quiet up here?" He'd asked me once when I was a kid, when the wind was howling around the eaves and I was scared. "'Cause we're in the middle of nowhere," I'd said. He'd laughed and pointed at the window. "Man, the air remembers. You don't need to talk as much when it does the keeping for you. That's why we don't say much up here. We don't want repeated." At the time I thought he meant gossip. Echoes. The way stories live forever in families. Sitting there alone in that cabin years later with that weird hello still on my mind, the memory suddenly felt different. I got the fire going, flipped on the little solar-powered light, and went back out for another load from the truck. The sun was gone by then, just a red smear behind the ridge. The temperature had dropped hard. I could feel the hairs on my nose freezing. I grabbed another bin, turned toward the cabin, then paused because I saw it again. My breath stretched out into that flat panel in front of my face, like someone had hung a sheet of frosted plexiglass right there. This time there was no mistaking it and no headlights to blame. COME. The letters were thinner, like someone had written with a dull nail on fogged glass, but they were there. I stood there holding this plastic bin, my gloves biting into my fingers, and watched the word hover for a few seconds before it unraveled and drifted away. I tested it again, twice, 3 times. Every breath after that was normal, no words. I wish I could tell you I went back to my truck and drove away right then, but I didn't. The cabin was paid off. The property, if we sold it, would actually help with my mom's medical bills, and I was pissed. Pissed at my uncle for dying, at myself for being scared, at the fact that my brain was apparently inventing words in midair. Now. So I told myself I was tired and jumpy, and I kept going, carrying bins inside until I couldn't feel my face. The real escalation didn't start until later that night. By then I'd warmed the cabin up a little, enough that the frost on the inside of the windows had started to sweat, little drops forming and sliding slowly down the glass. I ate a can of soup straight from the pot, flipped through my uncle's old notebooks, and tried to ignore that itchy feeling of being watched that empty places get. At some point, I walked over to the closest window and breathed on it without really thinking. My breath fogged the already thin frost, and for a second, all I saw was a smeared milky patch. Then the frost started to clear on its own. Not melt clear. Thin lines appeared where the frost receded in narrow strokes, like something tracing from the other side. Letters emerged, pale and crystalline, carved out of the frost in neat grooves. COMEOUTSIDE. The words stretched across the pane at eye level, perfectly centered. My stomach dropped. I hadn't written that. I hadn't touched the glass. My hand hovered there, an inch away, and I watched as a few stray ice crystals still fell from the edges of the letters, catching the light. I tried to break it. I exhaled hard on the words, thinking if I fogged it, maybe I'd just blur them out and then they'd disappear. My breath clouded the window, hid the letters, then receded, and the message was still there, sharp as if someone had scraped it with a razor. That was the moment I remembered my uncle saying, The air remembers. And I realized he'd said it dead serious. No smile. There was no cell service, of course. Even standing out on the porch later, holding my phone up like an idiot, I had nothing to call for help. I'd have to drive back down the mountain in the dark on that ice-slick track. I told myself I'd do it in the morning, that I'd just ignore whatever this was until then. I lasted maybe 15 minutes before curiosity and fear pushed me right into doing what the window said. I put my coat back on, grabbed my headlamp, and stepped out into the night. The snow had stopped falling, but the sky was just a low, heavy darkness pressing down on the trees. The beam of my headlamp caught branches and glittering ice, and every sound my boots, the wood creaking, felt way too loud. I exhaled and watched closely. This time, my breath didn't just spell something. It and the mist already hanging in the hollow around the cabin actually moved. Every wisp of breath, every little ghost of fog that might have just drifted away, instead seemed to get pulled in one direction, out toward the tree line. They gathered and flattened about 5 feet in front of me in that same impossible way, and new words slid across the sheet of air. UNDERTREEE. As I started walking in the direction the panel was facing, it drifted ahead of me, just out of reach, always the same distance, like a sign being held up by an invisible person backing away slowly, leading me. Every time I exhaled, the word under tree refreshed, white letters quivering like the air was low on ink. I'm not proud of what happened next. I followed it. It led me off the little cleared area around the cabin and into the thicker woods. Snow brushed against my thighs. Branches snagged my sleeves. The cold was the kind that burns, that turns your teeth into aching stones in your face. My headlamp carved out a small cone of visibility, and beyond that there was nothing but darkness and the pale panel of letters floating ahead. Finally, I saw it. The tree. You know how some trees just look older than everything else? This one was massive, trunk thicker than my truck, roots like frozen waves rolling out from the base and back into the ground. I recognized it. My uncle had pointed it out once and called it the oldest thing up here. As I approached, the words in the air changed. H-E-R-E. The letters were bolder, right over the shallow, snow-filled basin formed by the tree's roots. I should have left. I should have turned around right then. Instead, I stepped into the hollow between those roots and started digging through the snow with my gloved hands. It didn't take long. The snow went down maybe a foot, packed and older near the bottom. Then my fingers hit something solid and not like rock. It gave a little under pressure, not frozen earth, not ice. I brushed the snow aside more carefully, my lungs burning, my breath tearing out of me in short, sharp bursts. Fabric appeared first. Dark, discolored cloth stretched over a bulge. Then the rounded shape beneath it, a curve of bone, a waxy suggestion of fingers inside what used to be a glove, the cracked leather of a boot partially exposed. Human remains, no question. My breath shot out of me in a gasp, and the air above the hollow grabbed it greedily. Found. I watched that word form hanging above the partially exposed body. I think I laughed, which was probably the borderline between fear and whatever comes after. I scraped the snow back over the remains with this weird instinctive care, like I was tucking someone in, then scrambled backwards out of that hollow so fast I almost fell. My headlamp beam shook. Every exhale came out in ragged bursts, writing fragments of words around me. Here, before dissolving. I don't know how long I stood there at the edge of the tree line, forcing myself to breathe slowly, before I could make my legs move. I made it back to the cabin, shoved a chair under the door handle, and then sat on the bed just listening. At some point, the messages moved inside. The frost on the interior windows had mostly melted by then, leaving fogged glass. While I sat there staring at nothing, words started to appear on the panes, not all at once, but in smears and strokes like someone was breathing on the glass from outside and writing with a fingertip. Leave, Toolate,
Stay.
The phrases were faint, overlapping in places, some half-formed. like the air couldn't make up its mind what it wanted to say. I tried to tell myself this was just my brain pattern matching, seeing letters in random streaks the way people see faces in shadows. But some of the words were too clean, and in the middle of all that, my uncle's voice echoed in my head. The air remembers. Don't say anything you don't want to hear again. Here's the part where I'm supposed to tell you I figured out what happened under that tree decades ago. That my uncle confessed from beyond the grave, where the sheriff came back with a perfectly logical explanation. I don't have that for you. What I do have is the boring official version. I left before dawn, drove straight to the nearest town with cell service and walked into the sheriff's office. I told them I'd found what looked like human remains near an old family cabin. I gave them the location, described the tree, left out the part with the words. They went up a few days later with a small team and a cadaver dog. I know because they called me afterward. Yes, they found remains. Yes, they were human. Yes, they were old, possibly decades. They were working on identifying them. Did my uncle ever mention anyone going missing up there? Any old stories? I told them the truth. No, he didn't talk about much at all. They never told me who the body belonged to. By the time the whole thing wound through whatever frozen bureaucratic pipes those cases go through, I'm pretty sure they decided my uncle was likely dead, before whoever it was even reported missing. The last conversation I had with a deputy ended with something like, "We appreciate you coming forward. Mountain does a good job of keeping secrets. Most people wouldn't have dug." I wanted to tell him I didn't dig because I'm a good person. I dug because the air told me to. I didn't, obviously. I went home. Months passed. I told myself it was over. I chalked the whole thing up to stress and grief, and the human brain's bottomless talent for filling in blanks. I kept that night mostly to myself, except for a heavily edited version I once almost told as a campfire story, and then stopped halfway through. Then winter came back around. This is the part that actually makes it hard to sleep. First truly cold morning of the season, I was walking from my car to my office downtown. Nothing special. Gray sky, dirty snow piled along the street. My coffee in one hand, my bag in the other. I cut through a little side alley to avoid a busy crosswalk. Exhaled and didn't even think about it until I walked into it. My breath didn't just vanish. It hit something at face level and spread out thin, turning into that same suspended sheet of fog I'd seen on the mountain. There was no reason for air to behave like that in the middle of a city alley, in a place I'd never been afraid of before. Letters started to form while I was still mid-step. Hello, same clumsy, uneven script, same slow, deliberate carving of the word into the fog. I stood there, alone in that thin strip of shade between two office buildings, watching the word hang in front of my face like a message on a screen. I could hear traffic at the end of the alley, the normal city sounds, horns, a bus brake squealing, footsteps on the sidewalk. Nobody else slowed down. Nobody else reacted. I tried something I probably shouldn't have. I exhaled again deliberately like I was answering. The new breath flowed into the floating panel, brightened it, and the letters shifted. S-T-A-Y. I just that. Hello, stay. Like whatever was writing in the air had found me again, and was pleased. I backed out of that alley so fast I almost slipped, and my brain went straight into denial mode. Maybe it was some kind of weird reflection off a vent. Maybe actual glass. Maybe my eyes. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. But here's the thing. Once you've seen your own breath write words for you, you don't ever stop checking. Every cold morning since, every time I see my breath, I watched 99 times out of 100. It's just fog. Normal. Harmless. On the 100th time, it lingers just a little too long, or curls like it's trying to make a curve of a letter before it thinks better of it. Once in a grocery store freezer aisle, I breathed out and saw a faint H start to form in the chilled air before it broke up. Once, standing at a bus stop behind a couple talking, their breath mixing with mine, a pale O hovered between us for a heartbeat. Most people don't notice the shapes their breath makes in the cold. Why would they? But I do. Now, I can't not. Every exhale feels like handing a pen to something I don't understand, and hoping it doesn't decide to write back. So that's my contribution to your true winter horror stories. I found a body under an old tree because the air told me where to dig. I left the mountain. The air didn't. I woke in the kind of cold that doesn't come from weather. It felt as if someone had opened a freezer around my bed and let the air settle over me until it seeped into my ribs. The cabin had been warm when I went to sleep. Fire banked low, windows latched, wind outside steady but not alarming. I'd come here to get away from everything that had been chewing at me for months. The deadlines, the noise, the feeling that I wasn't keeping up with my own life. I thought a few quiet nights in the mountains might smooth the edges. But that cold wasn't natural. I knew that before I even opened my eyes. When I finally sat up, my breath trailed in front of me in a thin, pale line. The fire had burned down to dull coals. That wasn't surprising. What stopped me was the window across the room. A layer of frost coated the glass so thick it looked like white paint. The pattern spread outward in branching lines too deliberate to be random. As I walked closer, the letters came into focus. They were carved into the frost, sharp-edged, glistening from the faint glow of the coals. Let me in. I didn't move for a long moment. The wind outside moaned against the cabin walls, but the frost didn't tremble. The words held their shape as if etched into stone. I leaned closer, trying to see past the frozen surface. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. A figure stood outside the window. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It only stood there, facing me through the thick frost. Its head was tilted at an angle so sharp it looked painful, almost as if the neck had been forced to bend further than any joint should allow. Even though the storm flung snow sideways across its outline, none of it touched the figure. It remained perfectly still, framed by the swirling white. I stepped back, my heel catching on the rug. The figure didn't react. It didn't knock, didn't twitch, didn't turn its head. It only stared, or seemed to stare through the frost and into the room. Then the tapping began. Light at first, a small deliberate rhythm on the lower frame of the window. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps again. The figure still didn't move, but the sound grew sharper, as if the source of it were closer than the glass itself. I yelled for it to stop, the words spilling out before I could think. The tapping ceased instantly. The silence that followed was too quick, too precise. Then a whisper came from the cabin door behind me. It spoke with my voice. Not an imitation, not a distortion. My voice exactly, as if someone stood on the other side of the wood, repeating words I hadn't said yet. The whisper was low, calm, almost reassuring. "Let me in," it murmured, using my own tone, my own breath, the cadence I heard every day without noticing. The cold deepened until I felt it in my teeth. I turned toward the sound, but before I reached the door, something else changed in the room. A new door had appeared at the far wall, a place where there had only been a small bookshelf the night before. The shelf was gone. The door stood slightly ajar, and from its gap poured a cold far worse than the window's frost. The darkness behind it didn't look like an unlit room. It looked like a depth that had no end. The wind outside went silent. Even the storm seemed to hold its breath. I didn't want to go near that door. But the whisper at the cabin entrance kept repeating my voice in a low, coaxing tone. The wrongness of hearing myself from the other side of the wall made my skin tighten. The figure at the window hadn't moved, but the frost between us creaked as if the pressure behind it were building. When the whisper shifted, dropping into a pitch half an octave lower than my real voice, I ran. I grabbed my boots without lacing them, snatched my coat off the hook, and forced the front door open. The storm hit me full in the chest. The cold outside was brutal, but it was honest. It didn't mimic my voice. It didn't carve messages. It didn't try to coax its way in. I ran down the path toward the tree line. snow already filling my footprints faster than I could make them. The wind pushed against me hard enough that I had to lean into it. By the time I reached the first cluster of pines, the cabin was already half lost behind the storm's thick curtain. That should have been the end of it. Physical distance should have mattered. Whatever that thing was, whatever it wanted, I thought I'd left it behind with the frost and the tapping and that impossible door. But halfway down the trail, the tapping started again. Not on glass this time, on the trees. I pressed my back against a trunk, breath shaking out in small bursts. The tapping moved a line of it shifting from one tree to the next, an invisible hand tracing its way around me in uneven circles. The storm hissed through the branches, but beneath it I heard the same rhythm that had started at the window. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps again. I kept moving, stumbling through drifts, eyes watering from the wind. By the time I reached the small emergency station at the base of the trail, an old maintenance shed with a metal latch and a narrow bench, my hands were numb. I forced the door open, stepped inside, and shut myself in the dark. The shed was warmer than the cabin had been. My breath fogged, but only lightly. I waited for the storm's sounds to settle into their natural patterns. They didn't. The tapping followed me. It started on the metal wall behind me, soft at first, then growing sharper. I pulled my coat tighter, turned toward the sound, and felt the cold settle into the air in a way that didn't belong to the weather outside. Then I heard it again, my voice. It came from somewhere near the back of the shed, threaded through the dark. Let me in. I pressed my hand against the door, ready to run back into the storm if I had to. But the storm wasn't the problem anymore. The cold in that shed didn't belong to any season. It didn't rise and fall with the wind. It settled close, aware, deliberate. I've moved 3 times since that night, each place farther from the mountains than the last. Each one warmer, each one with better insulation, thicker doors, newer windows. But the tapping still returns, sometimes on the walls, sometimes on the furniture, sometimes on the glass when the outside temperature drops. And every winter night without fail, I hear my own voice whisper from somewhere in the room, just soft enough that I can't tell if it's on the other side of the door or standing right behind me. It always says the same thing. Let me in. I bought the snow globe on a gray afternoon that should have passed without notice. I'd been drifting through the back aisles of a second-hand shop, wedged between a laundromat and a shuttered bakery. The kind of place that smelled of dust and old plaster. My habit of digging through forgotten things had pulled me through its door again. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I never was. I just liked the sense that something overlooked might choose me. And that day, something did. The snow globe sat alone on a bottom shelf, pushed so far back it had gathered a film of dust along its base. When I touched it, the glass was colder than the room around it. Heavy, too far heavier than anything its size should have been. The snow inside wasn't normal either. It glittered like ground metal catching stray light, swirling in slow motion around a tiny figure of a man standing on the edge of a cliff. His posture suggested he was looking at something beyond the drop, though the sculpted landscape gave nothing else to see. I felt a little tug then, a quiet impulse that made no sense. I bought it without thinking. At home, I set it on my desk, where the street lamp outside cast just enough light to catch the metallic flakes. It would shift on their own sometimes, even when I hadn't touched the globe, drifting in gentle arcs as if stirred by a phantom breeze. I told myself it was static or some draft sneaking through a gap in the window frame. It was easier to hold to that than admit how long I sat watching it, waiting for something I couldn't name. The first dream came a week later. I remember the cold before anything else. Not the sharp sting of winter air on skin, but something deeper, a cold without source or mercy, as if it rose from beneath the ground. I stood on a desolate snow plain stretching in every direction, a smooth, unbroken sheet of white that swallowed sound. The sky looked bruised, the kind of light that comes before a storm, but never quite commits to one. I didn't know where I was, only that the place didn't feel empty. It felt like someone had just stepped out of sight. I walked without choosing a direction. My boots sank a little with each step, compressing the snow into shallow impressions. There was nothing to guide me, but I kept moving, thinking the landscape might shift or reveal some landmark. Instead, the plain stayed the same, a stillness so complete I could hear my own breathing. Then I caught sight of a shape ahead, dark, low to the ground. As I approached, the outline sharpened into something deeply wrong. It was me, not an imitation, not a stranger who merely resembled me. It was my reflection, except it wasn't reflected in glass. It crouched on the snow, its arms looped around its legs, its head tilted like it had been waiting. The face was mine, but stretched in places, as though pulled too tight over the bone. The eyes shimmered as if a thin layer of frost had formed across them. When it opened its mouth, the breath that spilled out was my own voice telling me in a flat, drained tone not to look back. Something was approaching. I shouldn't turn, I shouldn't see it. I stood frozen, my pulse hammering against the inside of my skull, the cold tightening around me until I felt brittle. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me to stay still. But whatever moved behind me dragged across the snow with a slow, deliberate sound, like a foot carving a path. A second set of breath patterns grew close, too slow to be natural. My own reflection lifted a hand toward me, a motion almost gentle, but the gaze behind that gesture made my stomach twist. I turned. The man from the snow globe stood just an arm's length away. Up close, he was nothing like the neutral, distant figure sculpted in miniature. His face was gaunt, stretched by angles that didn't belong on a human skull. His skin looked wind-scoured, and his eyes were two dark hollows that seemed to contain movement just beyond perception. The smile, if that's what it was, cut jaggedly across his face like a rip held open by invisible hooks. I woke with a sharp jolt, chest heaving, sheets damp with cold sweat. The room shouldn't have been cold, but it was as if whatever I'd seen had followed me into waking. My eyes drifted automatically to the snow globe on the desk. I expected it to be the same as always. The man alone on the cliff, the unbearable stillness. But the scene had changed. There were now two figures. One stood exactly where it always had, the cliff's edge, head slightly bowed. But beside him was a second figure positioned at just the right angle, wearing clothes that looked suspiciously like the ones I had worn the previous day. The shape of the shoulders, the way the arms hung, too close to be coincidence. I leaned in, heart thudding as I realized the figure wasn't added crudely or glued in later. It was cast into the landscape with the same age detail as everything else, as though it had always been part of it. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lights on and forced myself to stay awake, trying to tell myself the dream had influenced my memory, that I must have overlooked the detail before. But deep down, I knew every inch of the globe. I had stared at it too many times. The next morning, I tried to get rid of it. That urge came fast and without argument. I felt ridiculous carrying it out to the trash bin behind my building. But when the lid clattered shut, I felt relief. Brief, shaky relief, like stepping out of a dark room into daylight. By the time I came back inside, the globe was sitting on my desk again. I didn't hear it return. Didn't see it reappear in any cinematic, dramatic way. It was simply there, the weight of it settling into the wood like it had never moved. A quiet certainty grew in me then, something I didn't want to admit but couldn't dismiss. I tried again to throw it out. I left it at the donation center. I placed it on a bench 2 neighborhoods away. Each time the walk home tightened my stomach, and each time the globe awaited me in the same spot. My desk became a kind of boundary line I couldn't alter. After the third failed attempt, I stopped trying. I told myself it was easier not to struggle against something I didn't understand. The dreams returned anyway, though rarely as vivid as the first. Sometimes I found myself back on that plain, sometimes at the cliff's edge, the wind slicing through me while the man's presence lingered just out of view. I learned not to look directly at him. I learned that the version of me crouched in the snow would often appear before he did, repeating that same silent warning through breaths that never quite warmed the air. Seasons shifted outside, but inside the dreams it remained winter. In waking life, there were subtler changes. My apartment felt colder even with the heat running. My reflection in glass surfaces seemed a fraction too slow to match my movements, just enough to make me look twice, and the snow globe scene continued to evolve in ways I could document, but never explain. The second figure. My figure began shifting its position over the weeks. Not dramatically, but enough that I could see a progression. At first, I stood a small distance from the cliff's edge, facing the man. Then, after another dream where I'd drawn uncomfortably close to him, the globe mirrored the moment. My miniature self leaned slightly forward, head tilted as if listening. The details grew more precise, more intimate. The sculpture captured the fold of my coat, the angle of my stance, even the slope of my shoulders during a moment of dread I recognized. I stopped dusting it, stopped moving it, stopped trying to reason with what felt increasingly like a future I was watching instead of a memory. And yet I couldn't ignore it. The globe had a gravity that pulled my eyes no matter where I stood in the room. The turning point came during the coldest night that winter. I woke to silence. Not normal silence, but a swallowed quiet like sound itself had retreated. The air felt heavy and faint flakes drifted through my room, catching in the lamp glow. For a moment, I believed I was still dreaming, until I realized the flakes weren't falling from the ceiling or the window. They were coming from the globe, leaking through a hairline fracture I hadn't seen before. The metallic snow trickled out and vanished when it touched the floor, evaporating into thin air. I reached toward it without meaning to, feeling an unsteady warmth pulse under my skin. The man inside the globe seemed to have shifted again, his stance angled toward me in a way I'd never seen. A small tremor passed through me, as though the line between the dreamscape and waking world thinned enough to let something bleed across. I knew then that resistance wasn't going to change anything. The object had chosen me. The path had been laid long before I understood it. Whether it was foresight or entrapment or something between those two states, I couldn't pretend that the visions were meaningless. The globe didn't threaten me. It didn't demand anything. It only showed me where I was headed. Over the following weeks, I noticed my dread shift into a quieter feeling. Not acceptance in the comforting sense, but an understanding that some futures leave no room for retreat. I stopped fighting the presence that moved through my dreams. I began stepping toward it. The snow plane no longer felt like punishment, just inevitability. Last night, the dream returned with startling clarity. I found myself on the cliff this time, the wind cutting along the ridge. The man waited there as always, his features no less distorted, but somehow less hostile. My reflection knelt near the path behind me, though it didn't speak anymore. It didn't need to. I already knew not to turn back. I walked until I stood beside the man, our outlines nearly touching. He didn't shift or acknowledge me, yet I felt a small current move between us, a recognition that settled into my bones. The flakes drifted slowly around us, metallic flashes against the dull sky. I didn't feel fear then, only a sense that I had arrived exactly where I was expected. When I woke, I went straight to the desk. The globe showed two figures on the cliff, standing side by side. The sculpted posture of my miniature self matched me so precisely, it felt like looking into a moment already lived. The globe hasn't changed since. I haven't tried to move it. The air around it feels colder each day, and I've started waking to the faint sense of snow against my skin. Though my room stays dry, I've stopped wondering what will happen. I know. The globe showed me the end before I ever understood the beginning. Some objects don't just tell stories, they finish them. I don't know when the final step will come, but I feel it drawing close, inching toward me the way the man did in that first dream across the snow. I can feel the path narrowing, the cold deepening, the quiet pulling at the edges of my waking hours. Soon enough, I'll stand where the globe says I stand, beside him, at the brink. And when I do, I don't think I'll turn back either. I went up to the ridge that winter, because I didn't know what else to do with myself. I'd burned out so thoroughly that even the shape of my own thoughts felt wrong, like I was walking around with a stranger's breathing inside my skull. The cabin wasn't much, just a single room tucked against a stand of wind-bent pines. a place I'd used once before during a better season. I told myself I'd stay a week. I told myself I'd get quiet. I told myself the storm warnings were just background noise I could ignore. On the first night, the wind didn't let up. It rattled the loose corner of the metal roof until it sounded like a coin flicked against an empty can. I sat at the small table with a lantern, throwing a dull circle of light on the floorboards. Snow hit the window in sharp bursts. But underneath the steady noise, I felt something else. An irregular hush. A space where one sound should have been but wasn't. It took me a moment to realize it was my own breathing. I kept catching myself holding my breath without meaning to, listening harder than I needed to, waiting for nothing in particular. Near midnight, I stepped outside to check the propane tank. The cold was so sharp it felt like a hand closing around my nose and mouth. My boots sank deep into the fresh powder as I walked around the corner of the cabin. With the lantern held up, I caught the slow drift of snowflakes tumbling through the beam of light. Then I felt it, that sense of being looked at from behind. Not a thought, not a fear, more like a physical weight between my shoulder blades. I turned. At first I thought the lantern was making shapes where there weren't any. The storm pushed curtains of snow across the tree line, blurring everything beyond a few feet. But then a gap in the wind opened, and through that clearing, I saw a figure standing among the pines. Tall, thin, motionless. The posture was wrong, shoulders too straight, like someone standing at attention in a place where no one should be. I took a step back. The snow gave under me with a soft crunch, and as if that noise stirred the whole world, the wind kicked up again and hid the figure. I kept staring at the darkness between the trees, waiting for it to appear again. Nothing did. My fingers had gone numb around the lantern handle, so I forced myself back inside and locked the door, even though I'd never bothered with the lock before. I told myself it was just the storm twisting shadows. I told myself I was tired, but I barely slept. And every time the wind scraped against the windows, I opened my eyes. The next morning, the cabin felt smaller than usual. I tried chopping a little wood outside to clear my head, but the snow kept falling, heavier now. I couldn't see more than 20 yards in any direction. At some point, I turned toward the ridge and felt the same pressure from the night before, an unmistakable pull of attention. I held still, axe head resting against my boots, waiting for the storm to thin for even a second. When it did, I saw movement. A tall, slender figure walking across the slope, not quite facing me, but angled enough that I felt its focus. It moved with a strange precision, each step deliberate, like someone imitating the act of walking rather than doing it naturally. The longer I stared, the more certain I became that it was looking straight at me. Then the wind shifted again, and the snow swallowed it. I dropped the axe and went inside. My hands were shaking, not from cold but from the clear, sinking understanding that I wasn't imagining any of this. Something was out there, and it had singled me out without giving me anything to work with. No footsteps in the snow, no voice, no shape I could make sense of. By mid-afternoon, the storm had hardened into something that felt personal. Gusts slammed against the cabin with such force that the walls shuddered and the trees groaned in response. I paced the floor, lighting and extinguishing the lantern just to have something to do. I kept glancing at the window and the door, even though all I could see was a smudged pane of white. Sometime in the early evening, the storm dropped enough for me to see again. I crouched beside the window and peered out. The snow had drifted up nearly to the bottom edge of the glass. The world beyond looked half buried. But there, near the stand of pines, I saw movement again. The figure stepped out from between the trees. Its posture was too straight, its limbs too long under the dark coat it wore. I couldn't see its face at first. The snow kept sweeping across it in waves. It moved slowly downhill, coming closer one steady stride at a time. I felt my throat tighten. I stood debating what to do, really debating it, as if there was an option other than fear. When I looked back out the window, the figure had drawn close enough that the face finally became clear. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. My eyes tried to make sense of it the way they try to find familiar shapes in shifting clouds. But the longer I looked, the more impossible it became to deny. It had my face. Not a resemblance, not a trick of distance. The face was mine, expressionless, pale from the cold, eyes unblinking beneath the dark fringe of wet hair. I grabbed the table edge because my knees buckled hard enough that I nearly fell. The figure kept staring at me. Then, without warning, it moved. It burst forward with a speed I didn't know a human body could manage. Snow sprayed behind it in a violent arc. I stumbled back from the door, knocking the chair over as I lunged toward the bolt. My fingers fumbled, but I got the lock engaged just as something slammed into the wood hard enough to rattle the hinges. I braced myself against the door, heart banging against my ribs. Nothing else hit it. No sound followed. I waited, each second stretching until it felt thin enough to snap. When I finally dared to look through the window, nothing was there. I didn't open the door. I didn't even stand near it. I lit the lantern and set it on the floor, because the table felt too exposed. I kept trying to convince myself the thing had run off, that the impact on the door was the last of it. But somewhere deep inside, under the panic, I knew it wasn't done. Night settled in, and the cabin grew colder. My breath drifted in small white clouds in front of me. I wrapped myself in blankets and sat with my back against the far wall, watching the door. At some point, I must have drifted, because the next thing I remember clearly is lifting my head and seeing a pale glow outside. The moon had broken through the clouds. I crawled to the window and wiped a small circle on the glass. The snow reflected the moonlight back at me, making the clearing look washed out and dreamlike. I scanned the ridge, then the trees, then the slope near the cabin. That was when I saw it lying in the snow. A body. At first, I thought some hiker had gotten caught in the storm and collapsed, but the shape was wrong in a way that struck me all at once. It was too cleanly outlined, almost posed. The arms lay close to the sides, the legs straight, as if whoever it was had lain down deliberately. I leaned closer. The face was turned toward the cabin, my own face. I staggered back and hit the corner post of the bed frame. The lantern flickered from the jolt. I stared through the window, unable to swallow or breathe. My own body lay out there, still as a fallen mannequin, snow piling on my jacket, settling on my eyelashes. Then the corpse moved. Not much at first. A tiny shiver, a twitch in the fingers, a tremor in the jaw. I pressed the heel of my hand against my mouth to keep from making a sound. The body's head tilted slowly toward the window. Snow slid off the cheek. The lips pulled back, revealing teeth clenched in an awful, distorted imitation of a smile. It held that expression for what felt like minutes. Then my eyes shifted upward and locked onto mine through the window. I crawled away from the wall, dragging the blankets with me, unable to look away even as my stomach pitched. The body didn't stand. It didn't move closer. It just smiled, that stretched, contorted smile with the snow clinging to its face. The wind rose again, flinging thick sheets of white across the clearing. For a moment, the storm swallowed the body in its glare. When the gust passed, the snow lay smooth and unbroken. No imprint remained. No hint that anything had been there at all. I couldn't stay. The storm was still raging, but staying inside was worse than facing the cold. I gathered what I could, just my coat, my boots, a pack with the bare necessities, and went to the door. My fingers trembled so badly I struggled to undo the bolt. I cracked the door open and let the wind shove its way inside, carrying icy flakes across the floorboards. When I stepped out, the cold wrapped around me like a clamp. I didn't look back at the cabin. I didn't dare. I pushed into the storm, forcing my legs to move through the waist-deep drifts. I kept my head down to shield my face from the wind, but every few steps I felt that same pressure behind me, the unmistakable sense of being watched. Once, when the gusts eased, I risked turning around. The clearing blurred through the snow. The cabin windows glowed faintly, and just at the edge of the tree line, I saw a figure standing perfectly still, tall, slender, wearing my face. I turned away and kept going. The storm didn't let up. I skidded on ice, caught myself on half-buried branches and pushed forward with the single-minded desperation of someone convinced that stopping for even a second meant losing something they could never get back. The wind roared so loudly that I didn't hear footsteps behind me, but I felt them somehow, small shocks of awareness at the base of my skull. I don't remember how long I walked. Time lost shape out there. The landscape was nothing but white twisting around me, blotting out the ridge, the sky, even my own footprints. At some point, the trees thinned enough that I recognized the slope that led toward the old access road. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look back again. By the time I reached the ranger's outpost at the bottom of the valley, my legs were half numb and my lips felt stiff when I tried to talk. The ranger who found me tried to ask questions, but all I could do was shake my head. He put a blanket around my shoulders and drove me to the station. I sat by the stove for an hour before I was able to speak clearly. I told him it was the storm, that I'd panicked, that I'd imagined things. It was easier than trying to explain what I'd seen. They sent someone to check the cabin the next morning. The ranger came back looking puzzled. He said the snow around the place was untouched. No prints, no signs of anyone walking through after I'd left. The clearing looked smooth enough to have been poured and set. I didn't argue. I left the mountain the same day and rented a room near town. For a while I convinced myself that whatever I'd seen was tied to that place alone. The isolation, the storm, the exhaustion I'd carried with me. But each night just before sleep, I feel the same weight of attention settle on me, a silent watchfulness I can't pinpoint. Last night, I woke to the faint crunch of snow outside my window. I live on the second floor. I stood there in the dark, afraid to pull the curtain aside, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. When I finally did, I saw a shape down below on the walkway, just past the railing, tall, still, facing up toward my window. The light from the street lamp didn't reach its face, but I recognized the posture, the unnaturally straight alignment of its limbs. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to hollow out the room. I've been awake ever since, writing this down, listening for any sound that means it has climbed closer. I tell myself I'm safe. I tell myself these walls, these neighbors, this town, these things matter, but the truth presses against the back of my throat every time I try to swallow. I left the mountain behind, but whatever wore my face in the snow didn't stay there. It found its way down, following the trail I carved through the storm, retracing each step with that same flawless, unnatural precision. I know it's still out there, watching, waiting for the moment I am alone again, and I am beginning to understand that some things don't chase you to catch you. They chase you because pursuit is the only shape they know, the only way they exist at all. I feel it now, just beyond the edge of the glass, patient and unblinking, learning the rhythm of my breathing, the pattern of my nights, the places I retreat to when I think I'm safe. I went to the cabin because I needed a break from everything. The kind of break where the world feels far away and winter steps in to close the door behind you. I'd rented the place for a long weekend, hoping the isolation would do what sleep and time off hadn't. I wanted quiet, stillness, a stretch of hours where nothing demanded anything from me. By the time evening settled in, storm had already thickened over the ridge. Snow tapped at the windows in an easy, steady rhythm, and the wind pushed around the cabin with the kind of force that made the walls creak at the seams. I kept the wood stove burning hot and tried to let the normal, honest cold of the mountains settle into the space around me. For a while it worked. I read until my eyes grew heavy, then drifted into the kind of half-sleep you get in unfamiliar places. I woke to a silence so complete it made my ears ring. The storm had cut off in the middle of its own breath. No wind, no snow hitting the glass, no branches scraping the roof. The kind of stillness that wasn't peaceful at all. It felt imposed, unnatural, like something had pressed its hand down on the world and told it to stop moving. I pushed myself off the couch and walked to the closest window. What I saw outside didn't look like anything I'd ever seen in nature. The night sky had gone perfectly still. The clouds that had smothered the ridge had pulled apart in a wide broken circle overhead, revealing a hard dark sky full of stars. But the stars weren't twinkling. They weren't shifting. They hung there like shards of glass suspended mid-fall, each one brighter and sharper than it should have been. Every few seconds they pulsed a quick faint flare that made them glow from within, like cold lanterns straining against the dark. The snow outside was frozen in place. Tiny flakes hung motionless in the air, each one suspended at a different height above the ground, forming layers like dust caught in a beam of light. I opened the front door to see it more clearly. The cabin's hinges squealed too loud in the silence, as if the world was holding its breath, and the noise had broken some unspoken rule. I stepped out onto the porch. The cold felt long, heavy. It pressed into my skin instead of biting at it. My breath froze in front of me, forming a thin plate of ice that didn't drift away. It stayed suspended, just like the snow. Then the sky shifted again. Thin streaks of light tore across it in jagged, erratic lines. They weren't meteors. Meteors don't split in two and rejoin. They don't double back or dart sideways like something with intent. These lights moved like cracks spreading across glass, branching outward in sharp directions that hurt to follow with my eyes. Every time one of the streaks arced overhead, the cold deepened so suddenly, it stole the air from my lungs. The sky felt closer, lower. Each pulse drew the stars downward by a fraction. When the next streak flared, one of the frozen stars broke loose. It fell silently at first, then hit the ground somewhere beyond the tree line, with a sound like ice snapping under heavy weight. The ground trembled. A thin, glowing fracture spread across the snow in a branching path. Another star fell, then another. Each impact cracked the frozen earth, sending fresh lines racing toward the cabin, like the veins of some enormous frostbitten creature. The fractures glowed cold blue under the snow, pulsing in rhythm with the sky. The silence finally broke. The storm returned in one violent gust, slamming wind and snow against me so fast I had to brace against the porch railing. But the snow wasn't normal anymore. Huge, jagged sheets of ice were falling, long, uneven shards, some spinning in the air, some dropping like thrown spears. They smashed into the ground hard enough to split small trees. The fractures from the fallen stars brightened with each impact. I stumbled back toward the cabin door, but froze when I saw movement in the storm. A shape walked between the trees. At first it looked like a trick of the shifting snow, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. A figure humanoid, featureless, made entirely of frost and ice layers fused into a tall, bent form. Limbs too long to be human, joints forming where no joints should exist. It moved with a slow, deliberate gait, each step cracking the glowing fractures beneath it. The face, or what should have been a face, was smooth, blank, a pane of frost glowing faintly from within. The light inside it pulsed in time with the stars. The storm thickened around the figure, pulling toward it as though gravity had shifted to center on that thing. Ice shards fell harder near it, exploding into splinters when they hit the ground. The fractures in the earth converged beneath its shifting legs. I took one step back toward the door, and the figure's head rotated toward me, not turning, not tilting, but pivoting, as if its entire upper body had moved in one piece. It didn't lean closer, it didn't advance, it just watched. The next pulse hit. You. The fractures under the snow erupted in bright, cold light. The storm surged downward with such force that the air itself seemed to collapse inward. I tried to reach the door, but the cold hit me like a wave, folding the world down into a sharp collapsing point. Everything went white. I woke on the cabin floor. The fire had burned down to weak coals. The lamps had gone dim. The silence hummed like distant wind through a narrow gap. My head ached with the kind of pressure you get after altitude sickness, and every part of my body felt drained, as if I'd been walking for hours through deep snow. I pushed myself to my feet and staggered out onto the porch. The storm outside was normal again, just steady snowfall and dark clouds rolling over the ridge. No fractures, no frozen stars, No jagged ice lodged in the ground. The world looked untouched, reset, as if the night had pulled itself back together. But the cold still lingered in a way I can't explain. Not a temperature, but a presence. A pressure behind the air. A reminder. I stayed awake until dawn, waiting for the sky to freeze again. It didn't. The storm softened. The wind returned to its natural patterns. But the silence behind it, the silence from that night, never really left. When I finally drove down the mountain, the clouds hung low, and the snow drifted across the road in lazy, normal waves. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that stillness, something patient enough not to show itself right away. Ever since that night, on clear winter evenings, I catch myself watching the sky for any sign of that impossible stillness. Every now and then, I swear I see a star pulse, just once, barely enough to notice, but enough to make my breath stop in my throat. The cold that came through that storm wasn't weather. It was a presence, a warning, and I know it's not finished with this place. I can feel it waiting just beyond the clouds, watching for another moment when the world is quiet enough to break again. I used to think the cabin only felt haunted because of who I had lost there. I spent most of my winters alone after that, working through old journals and boxes of keepsakes I couldn't bring myself to throw away. Grief settles differently in familiar places. It seeps into the seams of the wood, the smell of the blankets, the way snow piles against the window panes. I came back every year because leaving felt like abandoning the memories that still anchored me. I told myself the quiet was good for me. I told myself the isolation helped. And for a long time that was almost true. The night it began. The storm had been steady since dusk. Snow drifted across the porch in slow, rippling waves, and the wind moved through the tray line with a low, constant hum. I sat at the table sorting through a small stack of old photographs. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. I was only half reading the dates written in the corners when I first heard it. A whisper, not loud, not faint, but carried with a kind of calm I felt in my chest before recognizing the sound. It came from just outside the cabin door. I thought my mind was playing tricks on me at first. The storm could mimic voices if you listened too long, but the whisper came again, clearer this time. A gentle call that shaped my name with a softness I hadn't heard in years. The cadence had that familiar lilt, the warm, steady tone of my relative who had passed. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. My hands went numb in the same instant that the need to hear it again pulled me upright. I stepped to the door without even realizing I'd stood. The whisper brushed the wood as if someone stood on the other side, leaning in. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't threatening. It sounded like comfort. The exact comfort I still found myself reaching for in the quiet moments of winter. I opened the door. Snow swallowed the porch under a pale, uneven sheet of white. The storm hovered above the trees, dimming the moonlight into a washed glow. The whisper drifted farther back, threading through the trunks with a strange clarity that should have faded with distance. I told myself I just wanted to confirm it wasn't real, that I needed to prove my mind was filling silence with memory. But a deeper part of me, the part that kept old photos tucked under my bed like talismans, wanted it to be real. I followed the sound into the woods. Each step pressed into the snow with a muted crunch. The air felt heavier the farther I walked, like the storm waited just above my head instead of around me. The whisper guided me past the familiar landmarks, the fallen birch, the half-rotted stump, the frozen stream. It sounded close, but always just beyond my reach, like someone gently moving ahead, expecting me to keep pace. The trees eventually thinned, opening into a small clearing I hadn't stepped into since I was young. Moonlight struck the snow in a long blue sheen. At the far edge, a figure stood motionless. My breath faltered. Even from a distance, I recognized the shape, the slope of the shoulders, the way the head tilted slightly left, the posture so specific I felt a sharp ache in my chest. Every detail echoed the person I had lost. I moved toward them slowly, afraid that a single sudden motion would break the moment. The figure didn't shift. didn't breathe, didn't acknowledge me. It simply stood at the border of the clearing, staring ahead, not at me, but through me, or through something only it could see. I reached a few feet away before noticing that the wind had died. The snow didn't fall. The branches above hung unnaturally still, like the entire clearing had been trapped in a held breath. My heartbeat grew loud in the quiet. I lifted a hand, inching toward the figure's shoulder, wanting to feel warmth, wanting to confirm the impossible. Just before my fingers met their coat sleeve, the silence collapsed. An inhuman laugh ruptured the frozen stillness, sharp, low, twisting in tone as if forcing its way through a throat that wasn't built to make it. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere. My entire body recoiled. The figure snapped out of existence, not stepping away, not fading, not dissolving. One moment it stood there, the next it was gone, leaving only the imprint of its absence in the snow. I stumbled backward, nearly slipping as the wind slammed through the clearing again. Every instinct screamed to run. The whisper returned, but now it was wrong, stretched, thin, mimicking a voice it no longer understood. It lured rather than soothed. And for the first time, I realized it had been luring me from the beginning. I turned and ran. Branches scraped my coat as I pushed through the woods. The storm felt alive around me, shoving at my sides, tugging at my hood, threading icy needles across my cheeks. Every time I thought the cabin should be close, the trees looked unfamiliar. I kept glancing over my shoulder even though I couldn't see anything through the shifting dark. I couldn't shake the sense that something followed a few steps behind, moving with deliberate patience, brushing against the quiet without disturbing it. When the cabin porch finally emerged from the trees, I didn't slow down. I yanked the door shut behind me and locked it, even though I knew a lock meant nothing against something like that. Snow dissolved from my boots, leaving small puddles on the floorboards. My breath fogged in the cold air. The lamp on the table flickered weakly as if straining to stay lit. I tried to steady myself, tried to convince my nerves that shock could twist any memory into something monstrous. But the whisper seeped beneath my thoughts, curling through the corners of the cabin like a draft. It sounded like the relative I'd loved, coaxing, gentle, almost tender. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't matter. The voice echoed from the walls, from the windows, from the spaces between each heartbeat. Something watched me. I couldn't see it, but the sensation pressed against my skin like a hand hovering just above my shoulder. Every room felt occupied. Shadows shifted in small, deliberate motions as if adjusting themselves to stand at angles. I couldn't see directly. I circled the cabin twice, checking locks, checking windows, checking corners, even though none of it eased the feeling of being observed. The whisper slipped through the cabin again, softer this time, trying to match the real voice it mimicked. Hearing it twist into mere familiarity made something deep in me curl inward. It reminded me of how grief could distort memory, how longing could fill the silence with ghosts. But this wasn't memory. It wasn't my mind replaying the past. It had intent, subtle, probing, patient. Throughout the night, the voice drifted from room to room. Sometimes it circled me slowly. Sometimes it hovered just behind the bedroom door. Once it sounded inches from my neck. Every time I turned, nothing stood there. Only the faint impression that something had just moved out of sight. Days passed like that. The storm outside shifted in waves, heavy then light, never fully lifting. I couldn't tell whether the entity was trying to coax me back into the woods, or simply waiting for me to stop resisting. I slept in brief bursts. I kept the lamps burning until I felt sick from the dry heat. Even the photos on the table seemed to watch me differently, as if the past itself bent under the entity's attention. Sometimes I heard footsteps in the snow outside, slow, measured pacing from one end of the cabin wall to the other. When I checked, the prints disappeared as soon as I opened the door. Other nights I caught glimpses through the window, a figure standing at the tray line exactly where the clearing would begin, just still enough that I questioned if I'd imagined the movement. The whisper never stopped. It threaded through my grief, tugging at the weakest parts. It told me that stepping outside would ease the weight in my chest. It promised comfort in a tone shaped from someone who once gave me real warmth. But beneath every familiar inflection lurked something colder, hungrier. I still don't know whether it wants me to follow or simply wants me afraid. Maybe the two are the same. The woods stretch out behind the cabin like an endless open mouth, waiting for me to make a mistake. And some nights, when the storm quiets and the voice softens into the perfect echo of who I lost, I feel myself leaning toward the door without meaning to. I stand there listening, hand hovering over the latch, wondering if deep grief can make the living easy to lead astray. The entity knows that. It has known it from the beginning. I can feel it watching me now, the same steady presence I sensed in the clearing. It never left. It only waits for the moment, when comfort outweighs caution, and each winter night stretches that moment a little closer. I don't know how long I can keep resisting the voice that sounds exactly like the person I most want to hear again. But I know this much. The thing in the woods is patient, and it knows the path from the cabin to the clearing better than I do. One night, it will call, and I won't be strong enough to question the sound. I'll step into the snow, following the whisper through the trees just like before. And when I reach the edge of the clearing, I doubt the figure will vanish this time. It will be waiting for me, motionless in the blue light, ready to lead me where I won't be able to return from. I'd come out to the mountains because I thought distance would help. Space, quiet. A few days where my thoughts could stop grinding against each other long enough for me to breathe without feeling like something was sitting on my chest. I wasn't staying in the cabin much this time, only using it for sleep, and spent most of my hours walking the forest trails to clear my head. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, soft and clean, the kind that settles evenly and leaves the world looking newly made. I stepped out just after dawn, hoping the cold air would scrape the restlessness out of me. The trail behind the cabin ran straight for a long stretch before breaking into a network of narrow paths between old pines and twisted birches. That morning, the only tracks on the ground should have been mine. They weren't. A few minutes in, I noticed them cutting across the trail ahead of me, a series of prints I didn't recognize. At first, I thought they belonged to a deer or maybe a large dog, something wandering close after the storm. But when I crouched to look, my breath caught in my throat. They weren't animal tracks. They weren't human either. The footprints were too clean, too sharply defined. Each one was an elongated oval, longer than my boot, narrow at the heel, widening only slightly toward the toe. They looked like impressions made by something walking with deliberate care. Each print the same depth, the same distance apart, the same perfect line through the snow. No drag marks, no scuffing, no variance in stride. They led off the main path into trees so old the branches seemed to bend under their own memories. I should have turned back. The smart part of me knew that, but solitude mixes strangely with strain. When the world has been pressing on you for months, the first sign of something impossible can pull you forward before you understand what you're doing. I followed the prints, and followed the prints. I followed the prints Bayodzi. The forest thickened quickly. The farther I went, the quieter the world became. Even the wind seemed to avoid that stretch of woods. Snow clung to the branches in heavy sheets that didn't fall, even when the trees creaked under the cold. The prints ahead of me looked fresh, untouched by drifting powder. They led me to a clearing I'd never seen before, though I'd walked those woods for years. It was a circular space, ringed by tall, ancient trees, their limbs tangled overhead like a woven ceiling. At the center stood a dark stone archway, tall, wide enough for a person to walk through, though no path led to it. The stone was rough, almost black, covered in symbols I didn't recognize. Lines, spirals, uneven shapes carved deep into the surface. Snow hadn't settled on it at all. It looked untouched by the storm, untouched by time. A pale light flickered behind it. Not fire, not a reflection, something softer, colder, like moonlight filtering through water, shifting in slow pulses that didn't match any natural rhythm. The air around the archway felt heavy, thick in a way that made breathing feel like a conscious effort. I stepped closer. The prints ended at the base of the arch. They didn't continue through. They simply stopped, as if whatever made them had vanished. The moment it reached the stone, my pulse hammered in my ears. The light pulsed too, faint and steady, washing over the clearing in waves. I lifted a hand without thinking, just to feel the stone, to prove to myself it was real. When my fingers brushed the surface, something cracked through the air. A shock hit me. Cold, sharp, electric, strong enough to jolt my arm up to the elbow. I stumbled back, breath locking in my throat. Then I heard it. My name, spoken in my own voice. It came from beyond the archway, thin and stretched, echoing strangely, as if it had been pulled through too much distance. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs held me in place. My name came again, closer this time, and then something stepped into the clearing. It moved like a person, but its proportions were wrong. Too tall, limbs too long, joints bent at angles that made my skin tighten. Its eyes were empty, pits of colorless frost. But the worst part wasn't its size or its silence. It was wearing my face. Not exactly, not like a mask or a mirrored reflection. My features were stretched, hollowed, pulled thin like something had studied me and tried to recreate a version, but missed the details, leaving the shape but not the substance. The expression was fixed, like a smile pressed into ice. Behind it, the archway's symbols flared with cold light. The ground beneath my feet fractured. Not the snow, the earth beneath it. Thin blue cracks spidered out in all directions, moving like veins, glowing faintly. The air shook. My vision buckled at the edges. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I was standing in the clearing or falling through it. The thing wearing my face tilted its head. The bones in its neck stretched with the motion, lengthening in a way that made a quiet, brittle cracking sound. The fractures widened. Reality felt like a pane of ice about to break. I stumbled backward, reaching instinctively for anything that felt stable. The world warped around the edges, the trees bending inward, the arch expanding and shrinking in uneven pulses. The snow beneath my boots shifted, not falling, not moving, but sliding under me like a sheet of glass tilting. The double stepped closer. My voice echoed from its open mouth. Not speech, not words, but the sound of breath, shaped into something that resembled a name. My name stretched into a tone that made my lungs seize. The fractures surged upward. I tried to turn, to run, to force my body through the buckling air around me. For a split second, my hand brushed a tree trunk, firm, solid, a physical anchor in the unraveling clearing. Then everything snapped. The ground collapsed beneath me. The sky folded inward. The cold hit hard enough to tear the breath from my chest, and the world shattered into a silent white nothing. I woke in the cabin, on the floor, half covered in snow. My boots were still on, my coat drenched. The fire had burned down to ash. Hours had passed, or maybe more. My head felt heavy, thick with pressure, like I'd been underwater for too long. I didn't remember walking back. I didn't remember leaving the clearing at all. But I remembered the voice, the fractures, the face that wasn't mine but looked like it had tried to be. I remembered the cold weight in the air as it stepped toward me, and I remembered the final moment, that silent collapse right before everything went black. For days after, I tried to tell myself it had been a dream brought on by exhaustion and cold, but whenever I stepped outside the cabin, I felt watched. The forest trails looked normal, but the snow never settled right on the path leading toward the clearing. Some mornings I'd find a single elongated footprint pressed into the fresh powder near the tree line. Just one. Never two. Never a trail. A reminder. A whisper in the snow that the thing I saw didn't vanish when the world snapped back into place. It's still out there. Still wearing my face. Still waiting for the moment when I go back into those trees alone. When the air grows too quiet and the sky feels like it's holding its breath, ready to fracture again. I went north that winter because I didn't know where else to go. Solitude seemed easier than trying to explain the exhaustion that clung to me like a weight I couldn't shift. I rented a small room in a dying mountain town, just a narrow bed, a rusted radiator, and a window that looked out toward the tree line. Most days the snow erased everything beyond the first row of pines, leaving only the dull glow of winter light smearing across the glass. I walked to clear my head, sometimes for hours, letting the cold burn the fog from my thoughts. Those walks took me deeper into the woods than I meant to go. The trails twisted in long, unmarked curves, half buried under drifts that rose to my knees. Some mornings the sun barely made it above the ridge, turning the snow a soft gray that made the whole world feel like a room with no corners. I kept walking anyway. I told myself I'd learned the patterns of the land. I told myself exertion would force my mind into something steadier. On one of those walks, 3 weeks into winter, after a storm that had blown the road shut for 2 full days, I saw it. At first, it looked like nothing more than a crooked roofline rising through the trees. The structure leaned against a slope as if it were trying to hide behind the ridge. The wood was dark, almost black, and half buried under decades of snow and rot. What caught my attention weren't the walls or the roof, but the icicles hanging from every edge. They weren't normal. They were long, narrow blades of ice stretching down in razor-like sheets, some nearly as tall as I was. They swayed with the wind in a slow, synchronous rhythm as if responding to something I couldn't hear. I stood there for a long moment, convinced the cold was making me see motion where there wasn't any. But the icicles shifted again, a faint shiver that rippled through the whole row. I took a step closer. The air around the place felt sharper than the rest of the forest. I could taste it. Thin, metallic, colder than winter had any right to be. The structure wasn't on any map I'd seen. I didn't think anyone in town knew about it. Something about that drew me in, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the exhaustion talking. My mind aching for something to break the monotony. Even something unsettling. Maybe I just needed to prove I hadn't imagined it. I pushed through the snow until I reached the sagging porch. The steps groaned under my weight. A dry, brittle sound that belonged to something long abandoned. The icicles clung to the railings like glass fangs, growing thicker the closer I got. A hard gust of wind made them sway again, and I found myself lifting an arm instinctively as though they might snap off and slice downward. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. When I nudged it open, the cold inside hit me harder than the cold outside, as if the structure didn't retain heat at all. Dust hung in the air in thin, pale sheets. The floorboards felt uneven beneath the snow that had blown in over the years. I stepped inside only a few feet, just enough to see the outline of a stairway climbing into darkness. Something in me whispered to leave right then. The silence had a weight to it that didn't belong to an empty building, but I'd been alone for weeks, and isolation has a way of making you ignore your own instincts. I walked a little farther. A faint creak sounded from above, like a footstep shifting on old boards. I stopped in the middle of the room and listened. Another sound followed. Not another step, but something lighter, almost like a breath sliding down the walls. I tried to steady my pulse, telling myself the wind could pass through unseen gaps anywhere in the structure. Then a voice echoed from the second floor. Leave. It wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted. It moved through the air in a low, drifting murmur that sounded like it had been caught inside the walls for years before finally slipping out. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere. Upstairs, behind me, inside my ears. Leave. My whole body locked. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I didn't even look toward the stairs. I just stood there, waiting for something else to follow. When nothing did, I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on that narrow strip of darkness above the landing. But before I reached the threshold, I noticed something through the broken front window. The icicles had multiplied. Where there had been a row of thin, glassy daggers, now there were clusters, hundreds of them stretching downward like a cage that hadn't been there minutes earlier. They grew as I watched, lengthening with the wind, twisting like living spines of ice. Several pushed inward, piercing the outer walls with splintering cracks that echoed through the structure. I stumbled backward toward the center of the room. The darkness around me thickened. The corners of the building felt deeper than they should have been, as if they were receding, pulling away from the lantern light that filtered through the broken window. A shadow moved across the far wall, tall, twisted, bending in angles no human form could manage. I told myself it was the wind again, or a trick of nerves, but something in the movement didn't match any pattern I recognized. It had purpose, slow and deliberate, like something bracing itself before stepping forward. The icicles outside began to scrape and groan against the siding. A heavy crack sounded near the back wall. A moment later, a shrill, crystalline tearing noise ripped through the room as several icicles punched through the wood in sharp, violent thrusts, scattering fragments across the floor. The cold intensified. I could feel it crawling across my skin. The next moment happened fast. The window to my right shattered inward, sending shards of ice and glass exploding into the room. A surge of freezing air rushed through, knocking the breath out of me. I staggered and turned toward the noise and saw it. A figure stood in the corner, motionless, tall, its outline completely obscured by darkness. The cold around it felt different, heavier, sinking into my bones, as if the temperature had dropped only where it stood. My vision tunneled, the edges of the room blurred. I felt my knees buckle. The last thing I saw before I hit the floor was the far wall bowing inward under a mass of growing icicles, blades of ice pushing through the structure, as if the building itself were being consumed from the outside. Then everything went black. When I came to hours later, maybe longer, I was lying in snow outside the ruins. The roof had partially collapsed. The icicles were thicker now, fused together in a lattice that sealed the broken walls like ribs. I could still feel the cold from inside the structure radiating outward in steady pulses, as if something beneath that ice-covered shell was breathing. I didn't look back again. I pushed myself up, shaking from more than the cold, and began the long walk through the woods, trying to put as much distance as I could between me and that place. The trees felt closer than before, leaning in around the trail, their branches heavy with ice that creaked as I passed under them. By the time I reached town, night had fallen. I locked my door, drew the curtain, and sat with my back against the wall, trying to steady the shallow breath scraping my throat. I still feel it, whatever lived in that structure, whatever whispered through its rooms. Some nights the radiator clicks in a certain rhythm, sharp and crystalline, and I freeze where I am. Other nights the wind presses against the window with a low rattling moan that sounds too close to that voice, drifting through the second-floor darkness. I don't know if the structure was alive or if something inside it had taken root after decades of winter swallowed it whole. I only know the ice was moving when I found it. I only know the shadow inside was waiting. And every night since, when the temperature drops and frost crawls across the glass, I can still hear the faint, strained groan of ice growing in impossible ways, pressing inward inch by inch, as if the memory of that place followed me down from the ridge and is slowly finding the shape of my walls. I came to the cabin that winter because I needed the kind of quiet you can feel in your ribs, the kind that strips the noise out of your thoughts until only the essential pieces remain. The place sat alone on a gentle rise above a frozen lake, its roof heavy with old snow, its porch bowed slightly from years of storms pushing against it. I'd been coming here since I was young, first with family, later alone, and eventually with the understanding that solitude wasn't something I feared anymore. It was something I sought. The first days passed in long stretches of stillness. I walked the perimeter of the woods, sketched the frost patterns on the windows, listened to the way the wind climbed the slope at night. The snow had settled deep that season, layers of packed white absorbing every sound except the occasional grunt of shifting ice beneath the lake. That was normal. That was familiar. What wasn't familiar started one evening, just after dusk. I'd stepped outside with a mug of coffee, watching steam coil into the sharp air. The moon hadn't cleared the ridge yet, so the night was thick, muffled, almost metallic in its quiet. I turned to go back inside when I heard it. Faint, low, and wrong. A creaking sound. Not wood, not ice. Something underneath the snowpack, bending under weight or pressure. It reminded me of an old hinge straining to move after years of rust. I froze, listening harder. The sound came again, a hollow groan that traveled through the ground and a thin vibration I felt in my heels. Curiosity pushed me a few steps forward. I shouldn't have gone looking for it. Anyone sensible would have stayed on the cleared path, but the crackle of questions in my skull always grew louder when I was alone, and solitude made even the smallest anomaly feel like an invitation. I knelt near where the sound seemed strongest. At first, nothing looked unusual. Just snow drifted into soft mounds, the wind brushing loose flakes into tiny spirals. But as I brushed aside a handful of crusted powder, I saw it. A crack. Narrow. Jagged. Too clean-edged to be natural. The snow around it had slumped slightly inward, revealing a thin line of darkness beneath. The creaking grew louder for a heartbeat, then stopped the moment I leaned closer. I should have gone back inside. The crack widened. No sound accompanied the movement. The snow simply pulled apart as if something beneath pressed upward. My breath caught as a shape broke the surface. A pale skeletal hand thrusting up through the white. It clawed blindly, fingers long and narrow, joints sharp as carved bone. Frost clung to it in a thick layer, catching what little light there was and scattering it into dull glints. For a full second, I couldn't move. The hand flexed once, then dragged its knuckles through the snow with a scraping whisper that slid under my skin. The ground shifted again. Something massive pressed upward, dragging the rest of its form behind the hand. What emerged wasn't anything I could categorize. It rose hunched and towering, its back bowed beneath slabs of frozen buildup that looked like layers of packed winter clinging to its spine. Its limbs were too long, too thin, as if assembled in haste. Frost coated every surface of its body. Thick ridges along its shoulders, thin crystalline sheets dangling from its arms like torn cloth. The head lowered at first, lifted with a slow grinding motion that reminded me of two stones resisting one another. Its face held no features I could read, indentations where eyes should have been, a mouth that seemed frozen shut, or simply never meant to open. Yet somehow, it turned its attention toward me. Not sight, but awareness. A cold pressure that pinned me where I stood. The wind died. The trees stilled. The world around us emptied of everything except breath and fear. The thing leaned forward, frost cracking along its torso. When it spoke, the voice didn't come from its mouth. It came from everywhere at once, vibrating through the snow and air and into my bones. A single word. Leave. The sound didn't echo. It sank, dull and heavy like something dropped into deep water. Before I could react, the figure angled back, folding into itself. It withdrew with slow, deliberate movements, sinking into the crack as though the snow welcomed it home. The hand slid beneath the surface last, its fingers curling briefly around the edge, before vanishing into the cold black. Silence followed. Absolute silence. Then the scraping started, a faint rhythmic drag moving beneath the snowpack, circling the perimeter of the cabin as I backed away. Each step I took toward the porch made my pulse climb higher until I could hear it against my ears. The scraping stayed close enough for me to track its path, but it never broke the surface. It followed me until I slammed the cabin door shut and locked it, though I knew the lock offered nothing against something that moved through earth as easily as breath. For hours I sat at the table listening. The noises outside were soft, inconsistent, scraping, shifting, the faint creak of snow bowing under unseen weight. Every so often, the cabin shuddered as if something leaned its weight against the outer wall. The lamps flickered, guttered, then steadied again. I waited for the voice to return. I waited for another word, another warning. But the entity didn't speak again. It just lingered. Days passed in a strange rhythm. Some mornings the woods were untouched, the snow smooth as unbroken parchment. Other mornings showed long, shallow depressions tracing slow arcs near the tray line. I walked as lightly as possible, always listening. The creaking beneath the surface sometimes followed me, even when I tried convincing myself it was the ice shifting with the cold. But ice didn't move with intention. Ice didn't pause when I paused. Ice didn't wait. Yet, I considered leaving, but the nearest road was buried deep under drifts and the path out wound past the very spot where the ground had opened. I wasn't sure if it watched that area specifically, or if the entire forest was its territory. All I knew was that stepping outside each day felt like negotiating a truce. Night was worse. The scraping traveled under the snow in long, patient sweeps, circling or drifting closer before fading away. Once, just before dawn, I woke to the unmistakable sound of something brushing the underside of the cabin floorboards. Not knocking, not pushing, just touching. Mapping, maybe. I didn't sleep after that. By the end of the second week, my nerves were frayed enough that even the wind felt like breath against the windows. I kept the lamps burning to push back the sense of pressure outside. My solitude, once comforting, now felt like a trap built out of my own preferences. It took me several days to gather the courage to leave. I packed quietly, trying not to imagine the entity listening through the snow. When I stepped onto the porch that final morning, the cold bit harder than usual. The sky hung the color of tarnished metal. The woods waited without movement. I walked slowly down the path toward the trail that wound to the main road. My boots sank deep into the soft layers, and each step sounded far too loud. I kept my eyes forward, even when the creaking began beneath me. Soft at first, then clearer. The scraping followed, a thin, deliberate drag just under the crusted surface, keeping pace with me, but it never broke through. Never rose, never called. Maybe the warning had been enough. Maybe it wanted me gone more than it wanted to confront me again. Or maybe it understood that terror alone could guide a person exactly where it wanted them to go. When the cabin vanished behind a bend in the trail, the noises faded, the scraping dwindled to nothing. The creaking dissolved into the ordinary groans of winter settling around me. By the time I reached the distant road, the woods were silent again. I didn't look back. I've stayed away since. Though winter still carries reminders, certain low groans under heavy snow, certain soft drags across frozen ground, certain moments when silence feels too absolute to be natural. Sometimes I think I hear that single word again in the wind, along empty ridgelines, not spoken but suggested, shaped in the shift of air. Leave. I listen every time. I obey every time. Some solitude isn't meant for the living. Some quiet has its own inhabitants. And once you felt one rise from beneath the snow, you don't mistake the sounds of settling ice for anything harmless ever again. I went up to the cabin that winter because I needed distance from everything I kept trying not to think about. The place sat alone near the tree line, where the slope began to rise toward the highest ridge, and the snow muffled every sound until it felt like the whole world had been pinned beneath a thick, cold hand. On the first night, I noticed the stillness most of all. No wind, no settling branches, no animals moving under the drifts, only my own breathing and the slow cooling of the stovepipe. Over the next few days, the cold settled deeper into the valley, and the sky stayed a flat gray that felt close enough to touch. I spent hours outside splitting frozen rounds, brushing snow off the roof, and trying to convince myself the quiet was what I had come to find. But it was on the seventh evening, while I was bringing in more wood, that I saw the first change. The western horizon should have been darkening into blue, but instead it turned the color of watered wine. A thin red band spread above the ridge, then deepened into something I had never seen in a natural sky. At first I thought it was a trick of sunset against incoming weather, but the red thickened until it was almost opaque. Clouds rolled in from behind the mountain, spiraling in slow, deliberate vortices that didn't match the wind direction. The shapes stretched and folded against each other, and within them outlines began to appear. Faces that shifted as if caught mid-expression, figure suspended in the cloud mass as though pressed up against some invisible surface. I stood near the woodpile with the cold striking through my gloves, staring until my breath pooled around my collar. I tried to reason it out. Polar stratospheric clouds sometimes threw odd colors in the right conditions, but nothing about this looked like refracted light or an ice halo. This was heavier, almost saturated, as if the mountain were lit by some buried ember. I remember thinking I should go inside, close the curtains and wait for the storm to pass, but I didn't move. Higher on the ridge, right where the slope sharpened, a single figure appeared. It stood in a gap between two boulders, tall and narrow, arms at its sides, entirely dark against the red sky. No movement, no gesture, nothing to hint at clothing or features, just a vertical silhouette at the edge of the world. I felt the temperature drop even though I hadn't seen any wind lift the snow. The stillness of the figure made it harder to look away than the clouds did. I counted the possibilities: another hiker, a shadow from a tree, even my own exhaustion, but none of them fit the way it held its place. I forced myself back inside and sat at the table until the stove's heat thawed the feeling in my fingers. I didn't tell myself it was nothing. I just told myself it could wait. But when I tried to sleep, the red light seeped around the curtains, and the cloud shapes pulsed faintly through the fabric. Every time I shifted in the bunk, I could picture that figure still standing on the ridge, fixed in the same position, looking down the mountain at the cabin. Morning never cleaned the sky. The snow fell in thin blowing veils, but the red hue stayed trapped above the ridge like a bruise that refused to fade. I tried to distract myself with work shoveling paths, clearing the shed roof, but I kept glancing up at the gap where I'd seen the figure. Sometimes the wind gusted, sometimes the air stayed locked in place, but I never saw anything move on the ridge. By dusk, my nerves felt stretched thin. I couldn't shake the sense that something on the mountain had taken notice of me when I should have remained invisible in the valley. I ate a quick dinner, washed the single plate I'd dirtied, and put more wood in the stove. The flames should have made the room feel safer, but each time a log shifted and cracked, I caught myself listening for something else beneath the sound. Some low rhythm, some slow footfall, some distant static threading through the wind. When the sky deepened again, the red grew darker than before. The swirling clouds reorganized into broad, sweeping arcs, almost like a slow current pulling everything toward the summit. And once more I stepped outside, telling myself I wanted to check how much snow had accumulated against the door. But as soon as I looked up, my focus snapped to the ridge. The figure was there again, exactly where it had stood 2 nights earlier. Still motionless, still watching. I don't know how long I stood in the snow before I realized my legs were moving, taking me a few steps uphill. The compulsion felt subtle at first, like the way a long trail can draw you onward through habit alone. But the higher I looked, the stronger the pull became, as though the figure were silently beckoning me. My breath fogged the air, and something in that cold made the choice for me. I climbed. The snow deepened around my boots, and the slope lengthened into a long white seam. The sky churned overhead, the red clouds rotating above the ridge with slow, grinding determination. Halfway up the climb, I realized my heartbeat had settled into a steady rhythm. Not panicked, not hurried. It felt as if I had resigned myself to reaching the silhouette. The compulsion wasn't a shout but a pressure, drawing me closer with every step. By the time I reached the gap between the boulders, the sky stretched across the whole valley like burning glass. The figure was gone. Only the wind moved between the rocks. Snow drifted over the hollow where it had stood. I turned, scanning the slope behind me, searching for any sign that it had slipped down the ridge or stepped behind one of the outcroppings. Nothing. Then a voice came from the air near my left shoulder. It wasn't loud, but the depth of it made the ground feel thinner under my boots. It said my name with a slow exhale, almost testing the weight of the syllables. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing close behind me. The ridge was empty, only snow swirled in the disturbed air. The voice came again, quieter as if it seeped out from the rocks themselves. The sound pressed at my ears, urging me forward, deeper into the shadow of the ridge. My throat tightened. I took a step back instead. The voice followed, repeating my name once more, drawing it out with a tone that didn't resemble anything human trying to threaten me, or comfort me, or reason with me. It just wanted me closer. I stumbled down the slope. The snow made my descent clumsy, but fear did what exhaustion couldn't. I didn't stop to check if anything followed. The pressure in the air told me something was moving. Halfway to the cabin, I caught a flicker of motion above me. The figure stood on the ridge again, but this time it shifted forward, edging closer to the slope. When it stepped off the rocks, the air around me tightened as if the entire valley held its breath. I forced myself into a steady jog, fighting the snow and the grade. The sky brightened with that heavy red glow, casting long black shadows from the trees. My mind fixated on the thought that the figure wasn't trying to catch me right away. It was watching how I fled, tracking the line I took downhill. Every instinct I had screamed to avoid looking back, but I slipped once and had to steady myself. When I glanced over my shoulder, the figure had reached the mid-slope and stood there, leaning slightly in my direction as if bracing to continue. I ran. I fell. I ran again. The lights from the cabin windows were a dull yellow against the snow, but they felt like the only safe landmark in the valley. I reached the porch and slammed the door behind me. My boots left trails of melting snow across the floor as I pressed my back against the wood, listening for the sound of anything approaching. Nothing came to the door. Nothing brushed the windows. The stove crackled in the corner, and the wind scraped lightly against the eaves. But outside, the sky pulsed with that red clouded glow, and the ridge seemed closer than before, as if the mountain leaned toward the cabin. I stayed awake until dawn. The red dimmed with the first light but never vanished entirely. Even now, when winter returns, the sky will occasionally tint itself into that same heavy shade above the ridge, and I feel the pressure in the air again. I watch the slope from the window, waiting for the silhouette to appear at the gap between the boulders. It hasn't returned yet, but I know the mountain remembers me, and something in the clouds is still calling my name. I came out to the cabin that winter because I needed the kind of quiet that doesn't leave you room to pretend anymore. The place sat at the far edge of a forest where the tree line sloped down toward a frozen creek, and it had been empty long enough that the path to the porch was half swallowed by snowdrifts. I told myself the remoteness would help me breathe again. The truth was simpler. I wanted to be somewhere no one could reach me, somewhere I could hear my own thoughts without flinching. The first morning after I arrived, I stepped outside with a mug of burnt coffee and felt the cold settle into my lungs like a warning. That was when I saw something dark embedded in the snow beyond the porch steps. I thought it was bark or a scrap of trash. I knelt to pick it up and brushed off the powdery crust, and the surface beneath my glove crackled like old leaves. It was a photograph, curled at the edges, the paper soft for moisture. It looked as though it had been dropped moments earlier, yet the image inside had the faded, off-color look of something much older. The picture showed a family of four standing against a winter backdrop nearly identical to mine. The same broad pines, the same uneven rise of the slope behind them. A man with a heavy coat stood on one end. A boy clutched his sleeve, and beside them a bundled infant rested in the arms of a woman. Her face was what made me sit down right there in the snow. It wasn't that she resembled me, it was my face, unmistakably, with that same slight asymmetry around the eyes that I'd never been able to hide in photographs. The paper trembled in my hand as if the cold had seeped into the ink itself. I checked the back for a date or inscription, half expecting to see my name. It was blank. When I looked up, the forest seemed too still, the silence too heavy, as if the trees had closed ranks while I wasn't watching. I carried the photograph inside and set it on the table under the lamplight. I tried to convince myself the likeness was a trick of expression. People see patterns where they want them. Maybe I needed that kind of explanation. But the more I studied the picture, the more my chest tightened. The woman in it wasn't similar. She was identical. The cabin felt smaller with the photo on the table, as though it had brought something in with it. I tried to focus on mundane tasks, stacking firewood, boiling water, sweeping the entry. But every time I walked by the table, my eyes went straight to that cracked edge, and my own face staring back. By late afternoon, the sky grew heavy with low clouds, and the world outside shifted to that bluish dimness that comes before a storm. I was restocking the stove when I heard a faint knock on the door. It was soft, almost hesitant. My first thought was that a branch had swung loose in the wind. I waited for a second sound. When it didn't come, I set aside the shovel and approached the door. There was something in the quiet that made my heartbeat quicken. I opened the door slowly, expecting nothing more than the night air. The porch was empty. Snow drifted lazily in the half-light, settling on the railings. Then I looked down. In the fresh snow directly in front of the threshold was a single human footprint. Bare, perfectly formed, toes splayed slightly, as though the person had been standing there moments earlier. The edges were sharp, untouched by falling flakes. There were no leading tracks, no trail away, just that solitary mark. I stared at it until my eyes watered from the cold. A bare foot in this temperature meant injury, disorientation, or something else I couldn't bring myself to name. I stepped back inside and shut the door, feeling the weight of the wood between me and that print. I didn't open the door again until long after the wind erased the shape. That night, the storm pressed against the cabin in long, slow breaths. Snow slid off the roof in soft thumps, and the branches scraped the siding like someone dragging their fingers along it. I tried to sleep in the small bedroom at the back of the cabin, but my thoughts circled the photograph, the footprint, and the way the woods had seemed to draw tighter around the clearing. Just after midnight, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I heard my name whispered from somewhere outside. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it carried the tone of someone trying to get my attention gently, as if coaxing me out to see something. For a moment, I froze, hoping it was wind cutting in a strange pattern. The next whisper was clearer, the syllables curling around the corners of the cabin walls. I didn't go to the window. I stayed still until the voice faded back into the storm. I told myself I was overtired, that isolation distorts sounds, but there was a steady certainty in that whisper that unsettled me more than any noise I'd heard in the woods before. When I finally got up for water, I found the photograph lying on the floor near the stove. I hadn't touched it since setting it on the table. The draft from the storm wasn't strong enough to toss a weighted frame, and the photo itself had been beneath a heavy mug. I put it back on the table, careful not to look too long at the woman's face. The next morning brought a thin sun that felt more like a lamp than daylight. The storm had left the forest muffled under a deeper blanket of snow. I walked the perimeter of the clearing out of some instinct to reassure myself, though of what I wasn't sure. I found no new prints, no sign of anyone. For a few hours, the silence felt normal again. Only the distant creak of trees and the soft rush of snow shifting in the branches. I tried reading by the window. I tried writing. Nothing held my attention. By afternoon, I had the sensation of being watched, subtle at first, then growing until I found myself glancing at every corner of the room. That evening, as the light drained from the sky, I heard my name again, but this time it came from the direction of the cabin kitchen. It was faint, as though spoken through fabric, but unmistakable. I stepped back, pulse pounding, and checked the windows. Nothing. I turned toward the table and my breath stopped. The photograph was standing upright against a mug, positioned so the woman's face angled toward me. I hadn't touched it since morning. The lamplight made the cracks in the paper shimmer like frost. The whisper came again, this time from behind me, close enough that I felt the air move along my neck. I spun around, but the room was empty. The air felt charged as if someone had just stepped away. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a trap slowly tightening around me. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, thinking that fresh air might break the pressure building inside. The cold hit me like a wall. The snow was undisturbed except for a narrow indentation near the porch railing. When I knelt to look, I realized it was another footprint, though only the heel had pressed clearly, the front half fading into the drift. I backed up toward the door. My name floated up from the snow itself, whispered through the powder as though the forest exhaled it. I retreated into the cabin and locked the door without thinking. The moment I turned the bolt, The voice shifted. It came from the opposite side of the room, low and steady. My name spoken as though someone crouched directly behind the stove. The air in the cabin grew thick, as if the walls had drawn closer. My hands shook as I moved to the far corner, unable to take my eyes off the dark space near the stove. I don't know how long I stood there, listening to my own heartbeat. The voice didn't return, but the impression of presence settled deeper, as though the thing that had whispered didn't need sound to make itself known anymore. That was the moment I realized I wasn't dealing with something passing through the woods. Whatever had left the footprint, whatever had placed the photograph, was already inside with me, woven into the spaces I had tried to claim as my own. Over the next days, the cabin developed a strange rhythm. The photograph never stayed where I left it. Sometimes I found it on the floor, sometimes on the bed, once propped against the inside of the front door, as though waiting for me to notice. The whispers came and went, always saying my name, always in that same quiet, patient tone. I stopped exploring the woods. I stopped going outside except to fetch firewood. The cabin no longer felt like a place I could leave or stay in safely. It existed in a kind of suspended tension, and I could feel the presence settling deeper into it, like frost taking hold of a window pane. I tried packing once. I lasted 10 minutes before the sense of being watched grew so strong that my hands went numb. I unpacked everything slowly, the way someone disarms a trap. I realized then that my retreat had already begun, not outward into the forest, but inward, into a space the presence seemed to shape around me. The isolation I had sought now felt like a net. What unsettles me most isn't the whispers or the footprints or the photograph. It's the growing certainty that the woman in that old image wasn't a stranger, that she had stood in a clearing much like mine during another winter, turning toward the camera with my same expression, before something stepped close enough for her to feel its breath on the back of her neck. Sometimes, when the cabin settles in the cold, I imagine I hear her too, another voice caught somewhere between the walls, as though the presence learned her name first and never forgot it. I've stopped counting the days. The snow outside has grown too deep for the path to be visible anymore. I rarely open the door. The whispering shifts from one place to another with a patience that wears down my resolve. Some nights it lingers in the hallway. Other nights it curls into the corners of the bedroom. I try not to look at the photograph now, but it doesn't matter. I can feel its presence the way I feel the other one. They've become intertwined in a way I can't undo. When the voice comes now, it doesn't sound like a stranger anymore. It sounds closer to my own, as though the snow and the cabin have learned to speak using pieces of me. I don't shout back. I don't move much at all. I listen, waiting for the next quiet call of my name, wondering how long it will take before I answer without thinking, before I follow the sound into whatever space it's been leading me toward. Since the moment I picked up that photograph, half buried in the snow, the last winter I trusted the snow was the one before my mother died. The year she was gone, winter stops were just measurements on a calendar, a way to carve the emptiness into seasons. The funeral in fall, the estate mess dragging into the first storms, and then finally the cabin. I told everyone I needed time alone to reset. That made it sound like a plan and not what it really was. Running away to the kind of silence where I could finally hear myself think, or not think at all. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow road that the county plow only touched when they remembered, surrounded by scrubby pines and drifts that grew into soft white walls. When I first pulled in, the snow looked clean, harmless, almost gentle. I stood on the porch and watched it fall, breathing the kind of cold that bites but doesn't quite hurt. And I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how simple it felt to be nowhere, with no one, and nothing left to do but wait out the weather. The storm that mattered didn't start loud. It crept in overnight, the wind thickening around the cabin like someone slowly turning up a static channel. The old windows shuddered in their frames. Snow whispered against the glass in tiny persistent clicks. I slept badly, drifting in and out of shallow dreams where I walked behind someone on a street I didn't recognize, always just out of reach, their coat hem vanishing around corners before I could see their face. By the time I got up, The world had narrowed to white. The windows showed nothing beyond a blank churn, a wall of moving fog with occasional shadows where the trees should have been. I made coffee, watched it cool in my hands, and listened to the storm wrap around the house. The drifts had already swallowed the bottom of the door. Even the slight slope of the path up to the lane was gone. No edges, no landmarks, just the cabin and the thickening veil around it. I told myself it was perfect. Total isolation. No cell reception, no traffic noise, no polite friends checking in, waiting for me to say I was coping so they could get off the phone without feeling guilty. Just me, the snow, and the kind of silence inside that I had been building for months. But as the hours stretched, the storm found ways to fill every gap. The wind got under the eaves and turned them into a low, droning instrument. Snow hissed through whatever cracks still existed in the old wood, leaving fine lines of powder on the sills. Even the chimneys seemed to breathe, exhaling occasional coughs of cold air into the living room. At some point in the afternoon, the power flickered and died. The refrigerator sighed to a stop. The faint hum behind the walls vanished. I stood in the middle of the cabin and realized how loud the storm had become once it had the space to occupy. I built a fire in the iron stove, more for something to do than out of real need. The orange glow flattened the room into soft, shaky shadows. When I stepped away, it felt as if the dark at my back pressed closer, eager to reclaim the corners. The hours after that blurred. I read the same paragraph of a book again and again without absorbing any of it. I stared at the flames until my eyes watered. I tried breathing exercises, counting, anything to give shape to the buzzing in my head. Grief doesn't cooperate with quiet. It spreads. As evening bled into whatever passed for night in that storm, I started to feel watched, though I was perfectly alone. It wasn't the obvious kind of paranoia. It was more like the cabin had grown pores, and the storm outside was pressing its face against every one of them, listening in, waiting. The first time I heard her, I thought it was the wind. It came as a rise in the noise, a subtle change in tone through the west wall, almost like someone calling a name into a pillow. I froze. The book slipped a little in my hands. I held my breath and listened. Nothing. Just the mutter of air around wood. I told myself it was the house settling, old beams shifting, the mind filling the gaps with what it knew best. Then it came again, adapting, as if it had heard my dismissal and wanted to correct the record. A swell in the sound, a curve of noise that shaped itself into syllables I knew by heart. My name, drawn out soft, with that slight question at the end that she used to use when she wanted me to come downstairs for dinner, without making it sound like an order. I stood up too fast, and the room tilted. The rational part of my mind jumped in immediately. The brain likes patterns. The wind just happened to rise that way. Grief changes how you hear things. Besides, it couldn't be her. She had been gone long enough for the paperwork to be boring. I had seen her body cold and small in that hospital room that smelled like an empty refrigerator, and no amount of snow outside a cabin was going to undo that. I told myself all of this, and yet I found myself moving toward the front door. By the time I realized I was halfway there, my hand was already reaching for the coat hook. The cabin wasn't cold. Not really. The fire still glowed behind the glass of the stove, and a slow heat had built up in the room. But standing near the door, I felt a different kind of chill, as if the wood itself held the temperature of whatever waited on the other side. My fingers shook as I pulled on my boots. I told myself I just wanted to check the drifts, make sure the chimney wasn't getting buried, do something practical. Still, my heart thudded in a steady, unfamiliar rhythm. Anticipation, not just fear. When I opened the door, the storm leaned in. Snow spiraled across the threshold in a sudden inhale. The wind hit my face like a wet cloth pulled from ice water. The world beyond the small square of porch was colorless, depthless. No sky, no tree line, just movement. The sound of it grew teeth the instant I stepped into it, closing the door softly behind me, leaving the cabin's dim light as a faint rectangle at my back. That was when the first snowflake touched my cheek. It was such a tiny thing, a speck of white no bigger than the head of a pin. Nothing special in the chaos of the storm. I barely noticed it land. I only became aware of it when my skin screamed. The pain was sharp and surgical. Not the ache of cold, not the numb, creeping burn of frostbite we all learned to recognize. This was immediate, localized fire, as if someone had pressed the tip of a lit match directly into my flesh and held it there. I gasped, reaching instinctively for my face, but my glove brushed it a fraction of a second too late. I felt the flake melt and smear, and the pain spread with it. I staggered back a step, breath fogging the air in front of me, and clapped my hand over my cheek. Even through the insulated glove, I could feel the heat radiating from that one small point, pulsing. A second flake found the exposed skin just above my scarf. Another spark. Another burst of agony. It took my brain a long moment to understand that it was the snow doing this. That the harmless, drifting white all around me was not cold at all, where it met skin, but blistering. I turned to go back inside, instincts belatedly overriding curiosity, but it had already started. Snow swarmed in, drawn to the sudden movement, the exposed angles of my face. A constellation of tiny impacts dotted my skin. Each one burned, each one bled into the next, until my cheeks, forehead, and the strip of flesh between scarf and hat became one raw, unified flame. I remember making a sound then, a hoarse animal thing, muffled immediately by the storm. I fumbled for the latch, vision washing in and out as tears sprang to my eyes from the pain. My glove slipped on the metal, which felt neither hot nor cold, just foreign. That was when I heard her again, clearer this time. My name carried somehow without distortion through the wind, as if the air had parted around the syllables to keep them intact. It came from somewhere to my left, away from the door, deeper into the storm. The tone was not urgent. It was patient, familiar, tinged with that old quiet amusement she used to carry when she watched me overcomplicate something simple. I froze, hand still on the door, snow eating at the exposed skin like 1,000 tiny brands. The rational part of me recited the facts. Extreme cold can cause hallucinations. Pain can sharpen and misdirect senses. I hadn't slept properly in days. Grief was known to make people hear voices. It listed these things neatly, calmly, as if we were in a therapist's office somewhere warm, not on a half-buried porch, skin blistering. The rest of me listened. There was something impossibly right about the voice. It wasn't just similar in pitch. It carried the exact cadence, the micropauses, the catch on certain consonants that recordings never fully captured. It pulled at something behind my ribs with a physical tug. She called again. Same tone, same soft lift at the end. It did not sound like a threat. It sounded like home. I turned away from the door. The snow thickened immediately, as if rewarding the choice. Flakes found their way into the gap at the top of my scarf, kissing the skin of my neck in blinding, precise bursts. I hissed, reflexively raising my shoulders, but I kept moving, boots sinking into drifts that had no discernible bottom. I couldn't see more than an arm's length ahead. The world had become a tunnel with no walls, defined only by the faint memory of where the trees should be. The cabin vanished behind me in just a few steps, swallowed by the uniform white. I tried to keep a mental map, porch, 3 paces, the bent pine on the right, the edge of the clearing, but the storm rearranged distance. Each step felt both too long and too short. Somewhere in that shifting blank, the voice waited. Time lost meaning. It could have been minutes or an hour. All I know is that the pain became a constant presence, a red field behind my eyes. Wherever the snow found skin, it left behind a rawness that throbbed in time with my heartbeat. My cheeks felt tight, swollen, when I dared touch them with the edge of my glove. The texture was wrong, ridged and wet, like new burns. The instinct to flee, to hide, to get back inside, and bury myself under blankets, fought with every movement. It screamed at me with an intensity that should have set me running, crawling, if I had to, back toward the dark square of the door. but the voice threaded through all of it, weaving itself into my steps. There's a kind of compulsion that doesn't feel like an order. It feels like inevitability, like gravity. Each time I hesitated, she called again. Never louder, never sharper, just present. Close, then far, then close again. Always just ahead. Always in the direction where the snow seemed to fall hardest. I stopped trying to reason with it. I just followed. At some point, I became aware that the burns were not just on my face anymore. Snow had found the thin line where my sleeve met my glove, the spot where my boot didn't perfectly meet my pant leg. Each new exposure became a doorway. Heat flared up my wrists, my ankles, racing under the skin in jagged lines. The layers of clothing trapped it against me, turned my own body into an oven. I pulled my scarf higher, knowing it wouldn't help. The storm seemed to enjoy the effort, found the smallest gap near my ear and slipped a few more flakes in, each one a needle of molten glass. And yet, beneath all of that, a different sensation, a strange spreading calm. The longer I walked, the more the immediate panic dissolved into something else. My thoughts slowed, aligning in unexpected patterns. I started to notice details I hadn't before. The way the snow around my boots didn't melt where it landed, remaining intact even as my skin beneath the layers screamed. The faint metallic tang in the air that was not quite ozone and not quite blood. The fact that despite the cold, my breath no longer made visible clouds when I exhaled. The environment had turned on me in a way that made no physical sense, and my body was too busy burning to properly register the impossibility. But some part of me cataloged it anyway, filed it under a new category. Rules no longer apply. I don't know how far I went. Eventually, I stumbled into a hollow where the wind eased for a moment. The snow here fell straight down, slow and deliberate, as if we were inside a globe that someone had gently shaken. The trees, vague shadows at the edges, leaned in but did not cross a certain invisible line. The ground under my boots leveled out. The voice was waiting there. It came from the center of that hollow, from everywhere and nowhere at once. My name, softer now, almost affectionate. The way she used to say it when I would come home late, and she'd been pretending not to worry. I turned slowly, trying to find a source, but there was only the falling snow and the formless, choking white. Something in me broke then, though not in the violent way I might have expected. It was more like a quiet rearrangement. The part of me that had been clinging to explanations let go. Grief, hypothermia, psychosis, supernatural interference. It all collapsed into the simple fact of the pain and the voice and the storm. I sank to my knees. The snow came at me eagerly, seeding itself into every fold of fabric, every weakness in my makeshift armor. It found my wrists, my neck, the line of my jaw. It found my lips when I gasped, and for one horrifying second I felt a flake land on the wet surface of my tongue, explode into a taste that was both scalding and strangely sweet, like overheated sugar. My skin felt as if it were peeling away in invisible strips. The air around me shimmered, whether from heat or from the limitations of my vision, I couldn't tell. I pressed my hands into the drifts, no longer trying to shield myself, and waited for whatever was going to happen next. The voice spoke again, and this time it wasn't my name. It was a simple phrase she had used 1,000 times when I was a child, when I fell off a bike or stumbled on the sidewalk and scraped my knees. A reassurance, a promise that it would be okay, that the pain would pass. No reprimand, no anger, just that old unwavering certainty. Hearing it there, in that hollow of burning snow, was worse than any threat, because I wanted to believe it. I let the storm have me then, not in the sense of surrendering consciousness, not yet, but in the sense of time folded. At some point, I must have collapsed fully, because my next clear in that suspension. All this time it had called me out, further and further away from the cabin, away from heat and shelter and whatever passed for safety, but it had never expressed any desire to return, to lead me back to the door. It only wanted me here, in this hollow beneath this impossible storm. Even in that thought there was no accusation, just recognition. I don't know how I got back. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I remember is the weight of blankets, the smell of smoke and half-burned wood, and the muffled, ordinary quiet of the cabin's interior. The storm's roar had retreated to a dull hum beyond the walls. My skin felt too large for my body. When I tried to move, a sheet of pain rolled over me in a slow, deliberate wave. My face throbbed. My arms and legs pulsed in hot, jagged lines. When I forced myself to lift one hand, I found bandages, neatly wrapped, crisscrossing my palms, my wrists, my jaw. Someone had tended to me. Someone had cut away the ruined clothing, cleaned the burns, and swaddled the damage in gauze. For a moment, I allowed myself the thought that it had been her, and then I pushed that away with a force that surprised me. A neighbor from down the road, as it turned out, one of the few people who still lived in that county year-round. He'd seen the light from my windows flicker strangely during the storm, and thinking the chimney might be blocked, had come to check once the wind eased. He found me on the porch, half buried in fresh snow, burned in places that did not make sense for exposure, babbling nonsense about the heat. He told me all this later, his eyes sliding away whenever I tried to press for details. At the hospital, they called it a bizarre case of cold burns, some combination of extreme temperature, moisture, and wind. They pointed to frostnip and frostbite charts, though what marked my skin didn't quite match. The patches were too clean-edged, too uniform, more like contact burns from a hot surface than the irregular modeling they were used to. They couldn't explain the ones under my layers either. The neat bands around my wrists and ankles where only a few stray flakes could have possibly slipped in. They did what they could. Skin grafts here and there, ointments, painkillers. They wrapped me up like a patient in any other ward, and discharged me once I could move without wincing at every step. I went back to the city, back to the kind of noise that never fully stopped, even at night. I told almost no one what had happened, and when I did, I edited heavily. The storm became a bad blizzard, the burns became frostbite, the voice stayed between me and the four thin walls of my memory. On paper, the event was simple: environmental exposure and injury during a winter storm. A cautionary tale about respecting severe weather, something you could fold into a public safety brochure. In practice, it was something else. Because the snow had not behaved like snow. It had behaved like a thing that knew where I was vulnerable, and the voice had known precisely which wound to press to get me to step into it. I still catch myself wondering, late at night, what would have happened if I had ignored it? If I had locked the door, drawn the curtains, built up the fire until the stove glowed white, and let the storm do whatever it wanted outside while I stayed in my small pool of human heat. Would the voice have faded? Would it have turned cruel, frustrated, something less like my mother and more like the thing that was actually speaking? Or would the snow have found another way in? I don't go back to the cabin. I sold it that spring, even before the bandages came off. The new owner sent me a cheerful email once, thanking me for the cozy winter retreat. They mentioned how beautiful the snow was out there in January, how quiet, how perfect for getting away from everything. I started to write a reply, to warn them, and stopped. The cursor blinked in the empty window for a long time before I closed it. Most days I can convince myself that what happened to me was some freak combination of weather and grief, a one-time event that will never repeat, a convergence, a personal hallucination with physical side effects. But there are moments when that certainty slips. Like last week, standing at a bus stop as the first flakes of the season started to fall. The city around me was its usual gray, impatient self. Cars hissed past. People hunched into their coats and checked their phones. The snow that drifted down was wetter, heavier than the powder at the cabin, melting as soon as it touched concrete. I held out my hand. A single flake landed on the back of it, on the thin pink scar that curves from my thumb toward my wrist like an old unfinished line of writing. It should have been cold. It should have vanished at once. Instead, for a heartbeat so short I could have imagined it, I felt that familiar, precise sting, like the point of a needle heated in a flame. I pulled my hand back into my sleeve, tucked it against my chest, and stared up at the sky, at the low, unremarkable clouds shedding their harmless weight on the city. Somewhere behind the thick glass of the bus shelter, traffic reports crackled through a speaker. The announcer mentioned a major winter event moving in over the next few days. They urged listeners to stay indoors if possible, to avoid unnecessary travel, to respect the warnings. I listened, calm and still, as the snow settled in quiet patterns around my boots, and tried not to hear the faint, almost familiar shape of my name in the wind that curled between the buildings. It started with the quiet, and I had driven 3 hours into the mountains, far enough that my phone lost signal halfway up the switchbacks. That was the idea. Cut out the world, finish the writing. I hadn't been able to focus on for months. The cabin was old, half forgotten, perched at the edge of a clearing where snow gathered in deep drifts between the trees. No neighbors, no roads plowed after a storm. Just me, my gear, and silence. The first night, the wind pushed against the windows like it wanted in. I read by lantern light, listened to the stove groan and tick as the fire settled. Nothing strange. Not until the third night. That evening, the snow hadn't stopped since dawn. I stepped out to bring in firewood and paused. Just for a second, out beyond the clearing, near the tree line, something vertical stood still against the falling snow. Tall, unnaturally so. At first I thought it might be a tree, but it was the wrong shape. Lanky, pale, covered in frost that caught the moonlight in a slick sheen. It didn't move, didn't sway like the branches around it. It just stood, facing the cabin. I left the woodpile half-stacked and went back inside, locking the door out of instinct. Maybe I was seeing things, but the next morning when I went out again, I found the footprints. They were wrong, irregular, too long and narrow, like someone dragging half-frozen limbs. They led from the forest to the window beside my bed. They stopped there. I didn't sleep that night. Every gust of wind made me tense. The next evening, just before dark, I looked through the front window and nearly dropped my coffee. It was there again, closer now, standing directly in front of the cabin. The frost on its body seemed thicker, its head tilted unnaturally, too far to one side, and I swear its eyes were wide open, unblinking, fixed on the glass. It didn't move until I turned away. That voice came next. Not from outside. Somehow it came through the walls, thin and crisp and dry like snow scraping on ice. It spoke slowly, dragging each syllable. "Let me in. I'm so cold." I didn't answer. I sat in the farthest corner of the room, flashlight in one hand, axe in the other. It called again. Always the same words, always from the same direction. Around midnight, the wind howled louder than ever before, and I thought I heard the door creak. Not like it was opening, like something was testing it. The next morning, I found frost on the inside of the glass, just around the latch. I made the mistake of staying another day. When I saw it the next night, its limbs stretched long and low, spine bent like a hinge. I realized I'd made a serious error. The thing didn't need the door. It could get in. It waited until I fell asleep, I think, because I woke to footsteps inside the cabin. Slow, wet. The air was freezing, colder than it had ever been. Even with the stove burning, I didn't look. I just grabbed my boots, my coat, and ran out the back, through knee-deep snow, down the narrow trail toward town. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs burned, and I could feel my legs going numb, but I didn't stop until I saw headlights. A truck driver pulled over. He asked if I was okay, but I couldn't answer. I just pointed back toward the woods. He took me to a shelter in a nearby town. I didn't talk much, but I told someone about the cabin, about what I saw. They didn't believe me. When I went to shower that night, I noticed the mirror was fogged over, except for one spot. Something had written in the condensation. 3 words, each one sharp-edged and crystalline, like they'd been scratched in with an icicle. "I found you." There was frost along the tile by the door. That was 2 weeks ago. I haven't gone back. But yesterday, when I stepped outside my apartment, there were footprints in the snow that didn't match mine. They stopped by my window and disappeared into the alley. It's warmer here. The snow melts quickly, but this morning the inside of my window was cold to the touch. I first heard it the second night at the cabin. A whisper, thin and wavering, barely audible over the wind rattling the eaves. It was faint, almost imagined, just the soft hush of my name, drawn out like breath against glass. I paused, one hand on the lantern, heart slowing as I held still. Snow fell steady outside, draping the forest in silence so deep it rang in my ears. I told myself it was nothing, just wind. By the third night, I couldn't pretend. The voice knew my name, it didn't shout. It invited, always just beyond the trees, where the trail thinned and curved toward the frozen lake. The locals had warned me when I rented the place. "Don't go out on the ice," one of them said, serious in a way I thought was quaint. "It remembers." I'd nodded politely, amused. A city transplant trying to clear my head. I wasn't expecting folklore, but the way it called, how it pulled. By the fifth night, I waited until after dusk, until the cold snapped hard enough to sting. The trail to the lake was barely a path, buried under inches of untouched snow. I followed the sound, the whisper drawing me forward with each step. At the edge of the lake, it grew clearer. My name again and again breathed into the wind with unnatural rhythm. I stepped onto the ice. The surface looked solid, clouded and thick, a pale blue sheen stretching out beneath a dusting of snow. But it creaked with each step, not like ice settling, like breath holding. I made it halfway across when I stopped, not out of fear because I felt something watching me from below. Then the ice cracked. It wasn't a loud snap. It gave way like a mouth opening. I plunged through before I could scream. The water was black. It swallowed me. I kicked, clawed, rose toward the fading shimmer of the hole above. But something stopped me. A hand. Not strong, just cold. Fingers like jointed glass. It gripped my ankle, pulling slow, deliberate. Beneath me, shapes moved. Long-limbed. Human-like. Dozens. Not swimming. Drifting. Their eyes open. Unfocused. Mouths slightly parted like they were waiting to speak. I thrashed. Kicked free. Broke the surface with a gasp. I don't remember dragging myself to shore. My clothes were frozen stiff by the time I stumbled back into the cabin, collapsing in front of the fire. My skin was blue. My ankle had finger-shaped bruises. That should have been the end of it. But I kept hearing it, not just at night. Every moment the world went quiet, in the wind between cars, in the hiss of the shower, always my name, always from a distance, whispering. I left the cabin the next morning. Didn't pack, didn't tell anyone. I just drove south toward warmth. I stopped at a cheap motel 2 states away. That night, when I stepped into the bathroom, the mirror was fogged despite the cold. In the center was a clear space. 5 letters. My name. The whisper came again, this time inside the room. I don't live near water anymore. I moved to the desert, but last week I found a shallow puddle outside my front door, even though it hadn't rained in months. Frozen solid. This morning I heard it again, through the vent, behind the walls. It's still calling me. It was never supposed to be permanent. The cabin was a loan from a friend of a friend, empty since late autumn. Half a mile from the nearest plowed road, it sat in a shallow valley surrounded by pines that bent low under the weight of early winter snow. I arrived just before the second big storm of the season, and planned to stay a week, maybe 10 days, just long enough to clear my head, finish some writing, and remember what it felt like to be alone on purpose. The first few nights passed the way I'd hoped, books by lantern light, firewood stacked high, nothing but the wind to distract me. But by the fourth day, cabin fever crept in. I took longer walks, broke trail through the clearing behind the cabin. That was when I found the trunk. It was barely visible under the snow, just a small hump, too symmetrical to be natural. I almost walked past it thinking it might be an old stump, but something made me stop. I swept the snow away with my gloved hands, revealing a metallic surface beneath the frost. Iron maybe, but dulled with age. The lid bore strange, looping etchings that looked too precise to be scratches but too random to be a language I knew. It had no lock, just a lip I could dig my fingers under. I hesitated, then pried it open. The cold that came out wasn't weather. It hit like a sudden vacuum. The warmth was pulled from my skin. My breath fogged and vanished in a second. Inside the trunk, darkness pulsed beneath layers of hoarfrost, and something whispered. Not words, just sound, a texture in the air, too sharp to be imagined, too subtle to place. I leaned in. That's when I saw it. Nestled in the center of the trunk, wrapped in threadbare cloth the color of dead leaves, was a figure, no taller than a child, skin the color of old wax. Its limbs were bent wrong, like it had been folded to fit. One arm curled over its chest, the other twisted behind its back. Ice had formed along its joints and mouth, but the eyes black, lidless, unmoving. I stumbled back, dropping the lid. It didn't close completely. A soft crack spread across the snow, a line of frost racing toward my boots. I ran. The cabin felt warmer than I remembered, but I still shook for hours after lighting the stove. I tried to tell myself it had been a corpse, someone's idea of a burial, a morbid relic from some forgotten ritual, but that didn't explain the cold or the way the frost kept spreading. By nightfall, it had reached the base of the nearest trees. I didn't sleep. I watched the window. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again, the whisper. But this time it was inside the cabin, not out loud in my mind. A flicker of syllables I didn't understand, brushing the edge of language. I sat with my back to the door, axe across my lap, and waited for morning. It never fully came. The light stayed dim all day, like the sun had forgotten how to shine through the clouds. I packed. I tried the truck, but the battery was dead. I hadn't driven it in days. That night, the whispers grew clearer, not in volume, in meaning. They weren't telling me to leave. They were asking me to listen. At one point, I opened the front door, just to see. The frost had reached the steps. Beyond it, the clearing was glazed with ice, and in the middle stood the trunk, open, empty. I closed the door and pushed the couch in front of it, and around 3 a.m, I heard tapping on the window. Not knuckles, fingernails. I didn't look. I couldn't. The sound came again, a pause, then a long, slow drag across the glass. I started a fire in the hearth, partly to stay warm, partly to feel like I could still control something. The whispers went quiet while I did, but when the flames died down, they came back. They didn't beg or threaten. They invited. By dawn, I gave up pretending I'd sleep again. I packed only what I needed and started walking. The frost was thicker than the day before, the trees silent and slick with ice. The air didn't move. Even the birds had vanished. When I reached the road, a snowplow passed by. Its driver startled to see me emerge from the forest. He took one look at my face and offered a ride without asking questions. I didn't go back. I stayed in a hotel 3 towns away, then crashed with an old roommate who didn't ask too many questions. Weeks passed. I tried to rebuild my days. Forget the trunk, forget the thing with the eyes. But the whisper didn't stay behind. It returned in quiet rooms, in the stillness between waking and sleep, when I walked alone at night. It spoke in dreams first. Then, while I was awake, always just beneath the noise of the world, it told me it remembered me, that it hadn't finished unfolding. 2 days ago, I woke to frost on the inside of my apartment window. Just a thin trace, like fingers had pressed against the glass from the outside. Last night, I found something else. A small symbol, scrawled in condensation on the bathroom mirror. The same kind that had been etched on the trunk. My hand shook as I wiped it away, but the glass stayed cold long after. And this morning, I heard a thump behind the closet door. I know what it wants. It wasn't buried, it was waiting. And now that it's found me, it began with a sound I couldn't place. I was chopping kindling behind the cabin when I heard it, high-pitched, delicate, like wind chimes echoing underwater. But there were no chimes, no trees moving, just snow falling straight down in thick, silent sheets. The sound came again, this time followed by a crack, sharp and thin, like a wine glass breaking in another room. I turned and saw the air shimmer. Not the snow or the sky, the air. A ripple, then a line. Suspended above the frozen ground, maybe 30 feet from the porch, it caught the light like a fracture in glass. Iridescent. Wrong. I stepped closer. More cracks appeared. Not in the ground, but in reality. They spiderwebbed outward like stress lines, glowing faintly blue, edges humming with energy too low to hear but too deep to ignore. Each one pulsed, slow and rhythmic, matching the beat of my heart until I wasn't sure which came first, my pulse or the hum. Then something came through. It didn't walk. It formed, extruded. Maybe from one of the largest fractures, a figure, towering, at least 8 feet tall, made of jagged crystal and opaque frost. Its limbs were uneven shards, some longer than others, bent at angles that defied anatomy. Where its face should have been, there was only a blank hollow, not smooth, not human, just a void. The air around it screamed, though the sound didn't reach my ears. It existed only in my bones. It tilted its head, or what passed for one. Then it spoke. Not a phrase, just one word. Impossible to describe, but I heard it as chosen. My body locked. Not with fear, something deeper. Like gravity itself had changed. The fractures pulsed brighter, and suddenly they were everywhere. Dozens, then hundreds, spanning across the sky, the trees, the cabin walls, glowing seams of something ancient breaking open. And the cold. It wasn't weather, it was a presence. The kind of cold that remembered being warm once, and hated it. The figure moved toward me without steps. Space folded. Each shift in its form rippled the world around it. My breath stopped fogging. My heart slowed. Behind me, I heard the cabin groan. Not from the wind, from pressure. I turned just in time to see the roof buckle. The wood split not from rot or weight but from a fracture in the air, slicing through its center like a glass blade. Inside, everything flickered, reality skipping like a scratched disc. 1 second the cabin stood whole. The next it was sharded, fragmented across a million mirrored planes. I saw myself repeated in the windows, staring back from dozens of angles I hadn't moved into. The entity reached out not to touch but to include me. And I realized what it meant by chosen. The fractures weren't accidents. They were openings. Gateways. And I had seen too much. My boots stuck to the ground. Not from ice, from a kind of anchoring. Like my presence was being rewritten into this new geometry. The landscape peeled. Snow froze mid-fall. Trees twisted and mirrored, forming impossible arches that looped in on themselves. Behind every reflection, a version of the world blinked and faded, none of them matching. I tried to scream, but sound curved inward. My voice died before leaving my throat. One of the fractures opened wider. The void behind it yawned with colorless depth. The figure stepped into it and part of me followed. Not physically, but like a thread of thought had been pulled loose. I staggered backward, out of its immediate field. The hum dropped in pitch. For a moment, I was outside the current. Then the entire scene collapsed. The cabin imploded into shards of itself, not splinters, facets, like it had always been made of crystal and had finally broken. The figure disappeared into the widening tear in the sky, leaving me standing in snow that now glittered with unnatural symmetry. The world reformed, slightly off. Trees grew at wrong angles. My shadow pointed north at midnight. The stars overhead pulsed like eyes behind frosted glass. I left that place, hiked back through miles of bent forest and shifting drifts, made it to the road, found people. Their voices helped. The light helped. But I haven't gone back. I can't. I can, because every mirror since then, every window, every puddle, shows cracks where there should be none. And sometimes when the world goes quiet, I hear the hum return, a whisper in glass, calling me back. I've always loved the cold. Not just snow or winter holidays. I mean the isolation of winter, the hush that falls after a storm, the clean emptiness of a frozen lake, the way the world feels paused. That's why I went to the cabin. Alone, miles from the nearest town high in the mountains, perched beside a wide frozen lake the locals didn't name on any map. They called it deep and still. That's all they said. I didn't ask more. I liked the stillness. The first week passed in silence. Then, one morning after snowfall, I stood at the edge of the lake, watching the sky reflect off the ice. It was glass smooth, flawless. I knelt to get a better look and saw my reflection staring back, but it was smiling. I wasn't. The smile was faint, not a grin, just the edges of the mouth, lifted in a way that didn't match my expression. I blinked, leaned closer. It blinked too, perfectly in time. Except, I felt something behind the eyes, like it knew it wasn't me. I stood fast and walked back to the cabin, telling myself it was a trick of light, fatigue, whatever. But I avoided the lake after that. 3 days later, I was chopping wood when I heard something, a thump dull, hollow, like a knock on a door through thick glass. I turned toward the sound and saw movement on the lake. Dozens of figures, just beneath the ice. They weren't walking, they were pressed against it, faces flattened, eyes wide, mouths open as if screaming in silence, hands clawed upward, fingers frozen mid-scratch. And among them, near the center, was my face again, distorted now, grinning wide, eyeless. I dropped the axe and ran. I don't remember slipping. I only remember hitting the ice. Ribs first. The cold bit through my coat like a blade. When I pushed myself up, panting, I looked down and saw myself. Not just a reflection. Me beneath the surface. Upright, smiling, moving. It turned without hurry and began to walk away, fading into the depths. And I didn't move. I couldn't. My arms worked, my legs worked, but I couldn't make them do anything. Something else had taken over. When I made it back to the cabin, I don't know how, I stayed inside for 2 days straight, curtains drawn, stove burning, eyes fixed on the windows. Every time I started to doze off, I heard it, a tapping. Not wind, not branches, knuckles, soft, rhythmic, deliberate. Then came the whisper, muffled, distant, like through snow, but clear enough to understand. It was my voice calling me back. Come see, come home. That night, frost formed on the inside of the window, in the shape of a face. Mine. It was smiling. I haven't gone back to the lake, but I hear it still. The tapping follows me, in motel windows, on bathroom mirrors, always behind frost. I know what it wants, and I know what's waiting just beneath the surface. I went to the cabin because I wanted the kind of quiet you can feel in your bones. Real quiet, The kind that settles over you when the closest road is miles away, and the only thing moving outside is snow blown off the pines. I'd rented the place before, years earlier, and I remembered its simple layout. One room in front, a short hall, 2 small bedrooms, and a back wall that pressed right up against a slope of rock. Nothing complicated, nothing that should change. The storm had already closed in by the time I arrived. It wasn't dangerous yet, but the wind had a weight to it, like it had been carrying the cold for a long time and finally found somewhere to drop it. I spent the first stretch hauling in supplies, drying out my gloves by the stove, and trying to pretend the growing noise outside didn't bother me. It was supposed to be a long weekend, and I planned to fill it with nothing but sleep, reading, and the slow thaw that comes from being alone after months of crowded offices and ringing phones. It was only when I walked the short hallway that night, heading for the back bedroom, that I realized something was off. At first it felt like the lights were playing tricks on me. The glow of the single bulb overhead was shaky, the kind of flicker you'd expect in an old cabin drawing power from a generator out behind the shed. But it wasn't the light that made me stop. It was the shape at the end of the hall. A door. Not the bedroom door, not a closet, a full wooden door with a brass knob, set into a frame that hadn't existed the last time I'd visited. The paint matched the rest of the cabin, but the wall around it looked wrong, as if someone had cut out a section and rebuilt it slightly crooked. The grain of the wood didn't match. The boards ran in the wrong direction. I stood there longer than I should have. My first thought was that I had misremembered the layout. Maybe this place had always had some small back exit I'd forgotten. But memory doesn't shift like that. Not all at once. Not with something so large. The storm hit the walls hard enough to make the windows vibrate. Snow scratched at the glass like handfuls of salt. The temperature dropped as if a draft had opened somewhere close, even though all the windows were shut tight. For a moment, the cabin felt like it had exhaled. Curiosity pulled me forward. I've always had that problem. When something doesn't make sense, it becomes impossible for me to leave it alone. I reached out and touched the knob. It was cold enough to bite at my fingers. I opened the door. The blast of air that hit me was sharp enough to sting my eyes. It wasn't like stepping onto a porch or into a yard. It was like opening a hatch on a plane flying through a blizzard. Snow whipped sideways in a blinding rush. I had to turn my head away to breathe. The door should have revealed the rock wall behind the cabin. I should have been staring at rough stone and patches of frozen moss. Instead, I saw nothing but storm, a rolling, swirling wall of white and gray, moving as if it had no direction, only depth. I shut the door fast. The knob left a ring of cold on my palm. I backed away, breathing too hard, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I checked the windows, walked through the other rooms, opened every door I could find, just to anchor myself in the actual shape of the place. Everything else was exactly where it should be. Only that one door was wrong. I told myself I'd check again in the morning. That storms distort things. That night makes simple structures feel strange. But the noise outside grew heavier. I could hear the pitch of the wind rising, folding into itself like something was circling the cabin at uneven intervals. Every time it passed the back wall, the impossible door rattled in its frame. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it broke apart fast. I woke up hearing voices. At first they were faint, buried under the sound of the storm, a low mix of tones I couldn't separate. Then one rose above the others, thin, stretched, warbling in a way that didn't sound exactly human. Another voice followed, and another. They didn't overlap so much as echo each other, repeating fragments that didn't form full sentences. I sat up. The voices were coming from the hallway. The storm outside had quieted just enough that I could tell the sound wasn't wind. I heard my own name in one of the echoes. Then a second version of it, blurred at the ends. It felt like someone was playing back a recording at the wrong speed. I stepped into the hall with the kind of caution you use when you're not sure the floor is going to hold your weight. The door was there at the end, just as solid and wrong as before. The voices were leaking from its edges, as if the storm inside the frame were speaking. I stood in front of it again, staring at the small gap beneath the door where cold air seeped out like a slow breath. The wood around the frame was trembling. Something tapped once from the other side. I reached for the knob. When I opened the door this time, the storm was silent. Snow hung in the air outside, suspended in mid-fall. Each flake was twisted in motion, but fixed in place. The wind didn't move. The trees didn't bend. The cold that hit me wasn't a rush, but a steady, unchanging wall. The voices were clearer here. They didn't seem to come from any direction. They seemed to come from everywhere above me, behind me, inside the air itself. Some sounded like distant strangers. Some sounded like me. Step outside. One of the echoes said in a tone I recognized but had never spoken in my life. I held onto the doorknob because it felt like the only real thing left. The surface of it burned with cold. When I breathed, my breath didn't move forward. It stayed in front of me, suspended like the snow. The door began to pull away from me. Not physically, not with force, but the frame seemed to drift backward, as if the world inside the cabin were sliding away. I stepped forward instinctively, trying to keep my footing. My boot touched the frozen snow at the threshold. The entire storm shifted around me without moving. Shadows slid through the suspended flakes, long, thin shapes that curved at the edges. They glided in slow arcs, circling as if they were considering me. None had features I could make out, only outlines darker than the frozen air. When I turned to pull the door shut again, the cabin was gone. There was only the frame standing free in the snow, a simple rectangle of wood with nothing on the other side. No wall, no hallway, no glow of the single bulb. The frame tilted, sagged, and folded down into the snow without a sound. I tried to run back toward where the cabin should have been, but the ground didn't behave like ground. My boots made no prints. The snow stayed fixed in midair, letting me move through it but not disturbing its shape. Every breath hung around my face like a cloud I couldn't escape. The shadows kept circling. Their movement was steady, unhurried. Every so often, one would glide close enough that I could feel a change in the air, not warmer or colder, just different, like pressure shifting before a storm breaks. They didn't touch me. They only passed by, examining the space I took up. My own voice echoed again, stretched thin. It asked a question I didn't understand. A second voice repeated it. A third fractured the last word until it was only sound. I walked for what felt like hours, though time didn't behave normally there. The sky never brightened. The storm never moved. Nothing aged. Nothing changed. The only motion came from the shadows, and my own steps pushing through the frozen air. Eventually, I stopped trying to track direction. There was no horizon, only the endless white. I stopped calling for help because the echoes turned my own voice back toward me in ways that felt wrong, as if each version had been strained through another layer of ice. I tried closing my eyes, hoping when I opened them again the cabin would be there, that the frame would return, that I'd see even a sliver of wood or the outline of a familiar wall. But every time I opened them, the world was the same: suspended snow, drifting shadows, and the sense that the storm itself was waiting. I don't know how long I've been here. Time slips. The cold doesn't numb or kill. It just settles deeper, becoming part of everything. I walk because stopping feels like giving the place permission to take whatever part of me still belongs to the world I left. Eventually, the shadow stopped circling and began keeping pace with me, gliding alongside at a distance. They don't interact. They don't touch. They only watch, as if I'm the anomaly in their world. Sometimes I hear the faintest creak of a door far behind me, but when I turn, there is nothing but the same endless frozen air. I keep walking toward the sound anyway, every time because it's the only thing that reminds me there once was a way back. The snowflakes hang around me, each one locked in its pattern. The cold presses against my skin without changing. The shadows glide at the edges of my vision. Unhurried, patient. I keep moving because the alternative is to become as still as the storm itself. Some nights, if nights even exist here, I think I hear the cabin settling, the stove rattling, the hall bulb humming. The echoes twist those sounds into something stretched and distant. I follow them until they fade. I don't know what this place is, or how a single door in a familiar hallway opened to it. I only know that once I stepped through, the world I meant to return to folded behind me like a page turning, and the frozen air closed in with its silent, unbroken storm. I can still see the frame of the door in my memory, sinking into the snow as if it had never belonged anywhere else. I keep hoping I'll find another door out here, some other mistake in the structure of this place, some boundary that doesn't hold. But every direction looks the same. Every echo repeats the same broken fragments. The snow never falls. The wind never moves. The world waits, and I walk through the frozen air, searching for a way back that may have vanished the moment I entered this one.